Well, as well, we appreciate you spending your precious and valuable time with us as well. I appreciate the work that you do and getting the word out about what's really going on, because there's no doubt that we are being lied to, and we have been being lied to for a long time. So I guess, first off, I've got you linked up over on latenightinthemidlands.com, so people can get over to your website and check you out.
Wonderful.
Maybe you could. Great. All right. So maybe you could take us through a little bit of your background and some of the time that you spent with the military's Department of Defense. Now, you were a librarian, correct?
That's correct, sir. What had happened was that when I was about 16 years old, and I was attending John H. O'Connell Vocational Institute in San Francisco, there was an Albanian receptionist who worked there who used to be the secretary to the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone. She happened to be in the office on the day that Dan White walked in, pushed her to the ground, and went through the door and shot dead the mayor of San Francisco and Supervisor Harvey Milk, who had replaced him in his job. And as a result, Dianne Feinstein, who is now a senator, succeeded to the mayoralty of San Francisco, and she felt she didn't need a woman around who was had a reputation for being George Moscone's lap secretary. So this lady wound up looking for a job and wound up being the receptionist at a vocational institute where I attended school. And I myself had grown up a military dependent. My father had been in the Navy for over 30 years. He was born in 1919, had run away from home to join the Navy when he was underage, about 16 years of age. He wound up serving in the China gunboat patrols up the Yangtze River in Spanish-American war relics that were still coal burners. And so these were the kind of situations that were made known to the public through the movie The Sand Pebbles that was written by a veteran of the Navy as well. That movie was actually started in a book format that was written by a naval veteran who had served as unhappily as my father had. And so my father's tombstone says it all. Says World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And the truth was that World War II started at the time that my dad was on those gunboat patrols when the Japanese bombed the USS Pan A and the HMS Lady Bird, and this was on December 13th of 1937. And from that point on, if you had talked to any American during that period of time, this was the Tonkin Gulf incident of its day, any American would have told you, yeah, we're at war with the Japanese in China. And it was just generally acknowledged. So the whole idea that there was a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, even in the public sense, is absurd. But the generation of that time had a real ability to rewrite their memories, and which is just fascinating to me, and is one of the primary reasons why they were easily manipulated by the PSYOPs, which I've been addressing in a lot of my discussions. But I myself, getting back to where I was in John O'Connell, she being Albanian, used to broadcast for Radio Free Europe through the Department of Defense to get transmissions behind the Iron Curtain into Albania. And so she knew that there were some openings in the DOD at a library that was on the Presidio military base, which I had access to as a military dependent. So she said, well, since you're a military dependent and you've already got access to the base, why don't you apply for this job? So I did, and I succeeded in getting it. And my entire life was to be changed from that point on in a monumental direction. So what had happened was once I started working there, I was a civilian working for a civilian bureaucracy on site a military base. And to put this into perspective for you, I had a very low security clearance, the same kind of security clearance that any military dependent has to get on or off a military base. I had full access to any open military base, barring restricted areas. But once I started working at the library, I was given a top secret clearance. But again, to explain this to the audience, a top secret clearance is the absolute rock bottom of security clearance levels. So if you've got relatives or friends in the military and they come bragging to you, oh, I've got a top secret security clearance, you really got to put this in perspective. And there are entire gradations of letter and numeric designations that add to higher levels of security clearance up to the point where it reaches just very, very bizarre titles. But the point that I'm making is that even the President of the United States, because he's only executive and commander-in-chief for 4 to 8 years, has a comparatively low security clearance level. Generals who are in for 30 years and then spend the next 10 years on some kind of consultation arrangement with the military in retirement, generals like that have security clearance levels that are far, far above that of the executive or the commander-in-chief, namely the president. So basically, I hope that puts it into some perspective for you in terms of the situation that I had, and then we add on to that the complex layers of corruption, stupidity, and incompetence that is so endemic in federal bureaucracy, which enabled me, not voluntarily, but under protest, to work with secret documents that were well above my security clearance level for almost a decade. And my primary responsibility was initially documents destruction. And I started off as the librarian's aide. Within a year was a military reference technician, and within 2 years was a full-fledged Department of Defense research librarian. But throughout that period of time, my superiors, our operations manager in particular, had far higher security clearance levels, but because when you work for the government, no matter what you do, no matter how incompetent you are, you can never be fired. You can even go postal, start killing your fellow office workers. They will send in a SWAT team to take you down, but you'll die employed. So no matter what you do, you can go to work, you can clock in, you can go to sleep. And that's what many people do. I've seen this all my life when working for the government. And this is why your government is basically run to the ground. This is why nothing gets done except by accident. So a lot of people ask, why is Douglas Dietrich still alive? Well, one of the things is, for one thing, this is the anniversary of my mother's death. She died very specifically. She died 1 year ago today. We might bring that up later in our interview. But the point of fact is, I did not survive unscathed. But I'm a lot harder to kill than my mother, who was 87 years old and suffered from traumatic brain injuries. And so besides that, I've got incompetence and corruption on my side. The weakest element is the human element, and it's humans that comprise the United States government. And it's not just any humans. It's the most lazy, incompetent, corrupt humans imaginable that are involved with the United States government at this point in history. And as we'll go over in our general outline of a lot of what went on with Asian Pacific and American relations tonight, and as well as American relations with the Native Americans at home, because it all shares into that general history, we'll find out that this has been going on forever. And it's amazing that it's lasted this long, to tell you the truth. I hope that puts it into some perspective for you.
It does, and you'll get no argument out of me. I mean, it's obvious the people who are in charge are just totally incompetent, and human beings, I don't know, maybe demons would be a better word for it.
I think that would give them too much credit.
Yeah, you're right. That's absolutely right. It just might.
But
now, did you...
Mm-hmm.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, I'd like to put that into perspective for you, however, because one of the
Please
things
do.
that I was assigned, on top of all the other responsibilities I was delegated, and that was the problem, because I was one of the few people who came, I was born in Taiwan myself, and so I have a Confucianist work ethic, and this is one reason why the Asian Pacific economies have succeeded so admirably, is because they do have a Confucianist work ethic and are committed to the same kind of dedication to work that Protestant Americans used to have in the days of Puritan pioneering when they first came to the United States, long before there was a United States government, 200 years before there was a United States government. So because of that, I was delegated all kinds of workload that nobody else wanted to do. One of the things that I was assigned was liaison status to the United States Army's officially recognized satanic chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who was later to retire a full bird colonel. He lives only a few blocks from me. He's basically a neighbor of mine. I worked with him for nearly a decade, and here was a man who basically reshaped a good deal of the Army in his image. We probably won't go into that too much tonight because that would take an entire show, that would be dedicated to that, and I could go.
We'll have to have you back.
I appreciate that, but I do want to emphasize the fact that some of the things I did for him, and the reason they assigned me as a DoD librarian, as liaison to the Satanic Chaplain, was because he had top-level security clearances of the kind that I've been mentioning. He was on second mint to NATO. He was in the World Affairs Council, and this individual, therefore, had access to not only secrets in the United States, but in the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth. And he took advantage of that status to basically order grimoires, or occult texts, from museums and libraries all over the world. Private institutions were out of touch for him, but public institutions such as universities and also the museums were within his reach, because he would use the excuse of national and international security, and he would say, I need these ancient grimoires or texts, and I need them for national security reasons. They would deliver them to the library as if they were fine china or porcelain by a courier. These are things that are normally in refrigerated safes or display cases, and even anthropologists or archaeologists are not allowed to touch them, because just moving them and opening them could destroy or compromise the integrity of the volume because they're so old. And they're literally priceless because they were handwritten. Some of them were written in blood. Some of them were bound in human flesh. And these things he would have taken to the library. Now, per regulations, they could not leave the library. He couldn't bring them home. He could order them, and then he had to use them at the library. And for this reason, I was personally witness to many satanic rituals within the library itself, because I worked the night shift doing document destruction. So while I was putting documents into the incinerators, which were truly, literally modified crematoria, because I was putting in entire locker boxes that were the size of children's coffins, the kind of wooden locker boxes that used to be found at the foot of military bunks back in the frontier days. These were used to host documents, and my job would be to open them, collate the documents, make sure they were the right ones to destroy, shove them in the incinerator. I'd be working throughout the night while this man and the various members of his coven would be operating satanic rituals, to which I was witness of the results. So I can assure you, there are demons within the military, and the reason that men like Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino succeeded so tremendously in reshaping the Army in their image was because the rest of the Army and the Department of Defense were so incredibly stupid, incompetent, fat, happy, and lazy and corrupt that one intelligent man of evil inclination could get away with anything he wanted.
Amazing. And that's not to say that, everybody in the military is bad, but that, the ones who are running it, certainly questionable.
Well, that's important to bring up, because I knew many of the officers who were victimized by Colonel Aquino. There was literally, later on at West Point, an officers' massacre. Now, those people I didn't know personally. I was much more familiar with the Presidio situation, but the Presidio was the epicenter of what scandalized. Let me put Presidio military base in perspective for you. Like, people will ask, perhaps, why is it that Dietrich is destroying such top-level documents? What are they doing at the Presidio military base as opposed to, say, Washington, D.C.? Well, the answer to that was that the Presidio military base was the Western Defense Command Center, and it was the headquarters of the United States Sixth Army. All of the wars in the Pacific, which have been all of America's wars, from the wars in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, which could be considered America's first overseas Vietnam, all the way to many Latin American wars on the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru, which America literally went to war over bird droppings, over guano, all the way to World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. All of these involved the Presidio military base as the center point of logistics. And aside from that, 3 weeks and 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the United Nations was formed on-site the Presidio military base, January 1st, 1942. And from that point on, unknown to most Americans, World War II was a United Nations conflict, like a Korean conflict. And the United States was subsidiary to the United Nations from that point on, which was established on the Presidio military base as an organization of war. Per Title 42 or Article 42 of the United Nations Charter. In lieu of a constitution, they have a charter. They are an organization of war, and they were meant to combat the Axis, and their primary military responsibility was direction of resistance armies in nations that were under Axis occupation. So that meant the resistance armies everywhere from Denmark through to the Philippines had their exile governments operating on the Presidio military base of San Francisco. So when it was relocated to New York City, come the ceasefire in 1945, all of its military documentation was maintained at the Presidio military base. These were the documents I was destroying in Maine, United Nations war documents pertaining to World War II.
Okay, and why don't we get into some of those documents? Tell us about the documents that you had to destroy, and maybe give us some detail if you could.
Before that, sir, was there something you were trying to get out before I so rudely interrupted? Was there something else on your mind that you wanted to bring up? Because the documents could bring us into other directions that could, take up a great deal of our conversation. I want to make sure that you get certain objects of interest out that you might have been thinking of beforehand.
Oh, you're absolutely covering it all. I'm just I'm sitting back and soaking in the information, and I guess the only other question I would have at this point is, obviously this is a plan that they've had for a long time for what I would call a new world order or one world government.
It's an interesting perspective, and obviously you're not alone in this. There are many people who share your opinion on this. But if you think the United States government is incompetent and corrupt, the United Nations goes it 10 times better. Believe me, the United Nations and the people involved with it, if they could, would they send United Nations forces into the United States to do the same kind of incompetent, violent peacekeeping that they do in other countries? You bet they would. But I'll tell you reasons why you don't need to worry about this. Examples of how they operate. When I served as a mercenary in East Africa, I probably saw more of the United Nations operating in the field that gave me a perspective on it that pretty much reaffirmed the kind of corruption that I saw in all the documents I was destroying. One horrible example of this was the kind of environment in East Africa. The lingua franca is Swahili, and it's spoken everywhere from Kenya down to the northern tip of Mozambique. And what you have is a Muslim-dominated culture in which there is, in the Swahili language, there's no word for woman. Literally, there is no word for woman. The closest thing that they have to it is mwanamke, which is a possessive, a noun that refers to ewes, sows, mares, and human woman as property of the masculine, feminine property of the masculine. That's the closest thing they've got. And as a result, their attitude is already bad concerning slavery. And female sexual slavery, by the way, slavery is legal in the Islamic world. Under Sharia law, Quranic law has slavery as legitimately recognized. And African slavery in the Middle Eastern Peninsula is rife and continues to this day just as it has for 1,400 years. The history of slavery in the Western world, chattel slavery, it's about 300 years old, and but you've got it beat by about 4 times that amount of time, and it still continues today in Southwest Asia and the Middle East. And so we ran into a camp of slavers where they had women who were locked in cages that were being sent to the markets in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, these women were being raped every day by their captors, and the United Nations was well aware of this. And their answer to this problem was to provide United Nations condoms, baby blue, sky blue condoms that were in United Nations boxes with the United Nations polar projection map on the cover of their boxes, just so that the slavers wouldn't spread AIDS.
I wonder if these are the same condoms they want schools to hand out to our children here.
It does make one wonder. And what we came up against at that time in order to liberate this camp was a United Nations force. Now, I'm very leery about speaking about this because there's always the possibility of being accused of war crimes by fighting against United Nations peacekeepers. and being brought to trial on The Hague. So I try not to give too many details, but I will tell you this. People we ran up against...
Don't get yourself in trouble.
I understand. But it's one of those things that it's this important to me to make the American public aware of what they would be up against with United Nations peacekeeping forces.
Okay. You
kind of were made aware of this with Black Hawk Down, though they never really emphasized it. But in Black Hawk Down, these U.S. Army Rangers were trapped in Somalia, and Mogadishu specifically, the capital of Somalia, nominally, in name only. There is no capital to Somalia. Somalia is a state of total anarchy. And when they were fighting their way out, there was an entire United Nations armored unit that could have gone in any time to have rescued them. And this United Nations armored unit just stood by, and that's what you see at the end of the film. It's accurately portrayed. When you see all those Rangers, all wounded, and they're just marching and walking, straggling would be a correct word for it, towards that armored unit of United Nations peacekeepers in those white armored cars and micro tanklets. These were all Pakistani Muslims who refused to rescue the American Army Rangers because they weren't going to open fire on fellow Muslims to rescue Christians. And in terms of what we were dealing with, were nominal Christians who were working for the United Nations. And what the United Nations had done was they offered all kinds of third world nations. And unfortunately, at this point in history, the Eastern European former Warsaw Pact satellite nations of the Soviet Union count as third world nations. They offered third world nations all over the world money to provide them with military peacekeepers for their wars around the world. Well, nations like Hungary said, and Bulgaria said, oh, yeah, well, we can just clear out our insane asylums. So they just cleared out their insane asylums of their most violent, deranged criminals and turned them over to the United Nations, who gave them all machine guns and set them loose in Africa for peacekeeping. These are the kind of individuals we ran up against. They were known as the Battalion of Madmen, because that's exactly what they were. And I'll tell you something. If you're coming up against this kind of peacekeeping force, a bunch of irate Pakistanis and madmen from Hungary, you've got very little fear in terms of opposition. The idea of them maintaining peace in the United States and projecting a viable threat is absurd. You don't even need a standing U.S. military to take care of these people. You can take care of them on your own with a well-formed and well-organized militia.
Unbelievable. I mean, it's believable, but at the same time, unbelievable. I mean, just pure evil. Pure evil.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. We're coming up on a break here, so what I want to do is just take the break, and when we come back, let's go through some more of these documents and the powers behind them. Maybe we could start with go from World War II right to present day, because we still have a couple hours to go here. So I'd like to get as much of this information out to the listeners as we can, because I think it's fascinating, and we've been saying it for a long time here that what they're teaching in the schools about history is not even close. And now we've got somebody who can speak up to that, and I love it. So hang on there with us, Douglas, and when we come back, we'll talk Douglas Dietrich, and he has seen with his own eyes much of the evil that we talk about here on this program often. So I will take calls in a little while, but first I'd like to get as much information as we can. The website's www.latenightinthe-midlands.com and www.project.nsearch.com, and of course the social network, www.nsearch, that's N as in Nancy, search.com. Go on over, become a member, be informed, and you know the rest. It's all there right on the websites for you. So we're going to get back to it here. And Douglas, I've got a question from a colleague of mine here. He says to ask you about the Coney 2012 video and how you would respond to that film that's promoting sending UN troops to Africa to get Coney, who hadn't been seen in years. And he wants to know what you think about that in general.
It's funny, a lot of people have been asking me about that, and with the kind of experience I had over there, I can tell you that my conclusion is that Kony is probably a very ruthless, a very, in his own way, evil man, and he's doing absolutely nothing that's any different from what most of the African warlords do. But because he works with the Lord's Resistance Army, which is primarily Christian in orientation, what he's gotten is an enormous amount of Islamic hatred arrayed against him and a lot of Islamic money to propagandize against him. So the very fact is, whenever you see any major new campaign, such as I believe there's a film, and I can't remember who's in it. I think it was Angelina Jolie, but I might be mistaken. And she was starring in a film recently about genocide against the Muslims in Bosnia. We have to remember that one of the major reasons why the United States committed to war against Serbia was because there was an enormous Islamic propaganda machine that rather they don't have their own propaganda machine in the House of Saud, which is primarily where America's foreign policy is dictated from. And there's a number of reasons for that. One of the most important reasons was because in 1945, shortly after Yalta, Franklin Delano Roosevelt met with the king of the House of Saud on the Great Bitter Lake. He was aboard the USS Quincy, and this was between the locks of the Suez Canal. And what he did was he took the Bretton Woods Monetary Agreement, which had been essentially established in the 1940s to make the U.S. dollar the reserve currency of the Allied world, which was essentially the majority of the world. The Axis was very much in the minority, geographically and in terms of population. So the majority of the world began to use the U.S. dollar as the reserve currency through the Bretton Woods Monetary Agreement. Now, he was presented by geophysicists of his day with the fact that he had floated the entire world war on American oil. America, the United States, was the Saudi Arabia of its day. Indeed, one of the main reasons, among so many, that Japan attacked Pearl Harbor was because the United States had cut off their oil supply. At that point in time, Japan got 95% of its oil from the United States. So when the United States cut off their oil supply, it would have been the equivalent of all of the oil powers of the world cutting off oil to the United States today, except worse. And that's one reason why Japan gets 95% of its energy today from nuclear power. But aside from that, what in this post-Yalta agreement with the king of the House of Saud, Roosevelt was confronted with the fact that he had used up every drop of easily accessible, sweet, bubbling crude that came to the surface of the ground to float the world in terms of the World War II war effort. He floated both nationalist and communist China, the entire Soviet Union, the British Empire, the French Empire, the Dutch Empire. To put this into perspective for you, the British Empire alone, because it ruled the Raj of colonial India, had over 1 billion people in its empire, had as many people, if not more so, than China. The Soviet Union was so huge that even with the collapse of the Soviet Union and the loss of all of its constituent republics, the core Republic of Russia is still the largest nation in the world today geographically. And Britain hadn't discovered its North Sea oil reserves. The Soviet Union had not yet been able to develop its natural gas reserves. Everyone depended for every drop of their oil on the United States. So one reason why we have an oil shortage today, you can thank Roosevelt. He used it all in one orgasmic explosion in World War II and was confronted with the fact by his geophysicists. They told him within a generation, they said, Mr. President, we're going to be out of easily accessible oil. And so he knew he had to sell out to the House of Saud. So on the Great Bitter Lake, on the USS Quincy, he met with the king of the House of Saud to buy him out from under the British Empire. And the king of the House of Saud knew he had Roosevelt by the throat. So what he did was he brought an entire flock of sheep onto the USS Quincy, which by dint of the president being aboard was the flagship of the United States. And these photos of these sheep on the USS Quincy are in the National Archives. They should still be publicly accessible today. I destroyed the originals, but people should be able to access copies of them or images of them on the Internet, one would hope. But the reason he brought those sheep was to lord it over Roosevelt. He said, Mr. President, these sheep are for your sailors and soldiers to copulate with, so that they do not defile our pure Muslim women. And Roosevelt said, Roosevelt took it. He said, my soldiers and sailors will do your sheep. And at that point, he nailed the U.S. dollar to the output of Saudi oil and created what was known as the petrobuck. That meant instead of gold, because he had taken the U.S. off the gold reserve standard in 1933 when he became president. People don't know this. Economists will lie to your face, and they'll say, Nixon took us off the gold standard. They're lying through their teeth. And if they tell you that, they know better, because Nixon tried to take us off the Bretton Woods monetary agreement. He wanted to reclaim American national sovereignty, and that's why they dumped on him like a pile of bricks. And if you honestly think they would have dumped on Nixon the way they did because he stole a few documents from a Democratic office in the Watergate Hotel, you are truly naive. And Nixon, if anything, in that sense, is an American hero. And he is totally viewed as a villain because the machine is in. And the point was that Roosevelt, again, appended to the Bretton Woods monetary agreement, the U.S. dollar to the outflow of Saudi oil. That's why we don't get nary a drop of oil from Saudi Arabia. All the oil we get is from Venezuela, shale oil from Canada, oil from Mexico, oil from Nigeria. We get it from everywhere in the world, but we don't get it from Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia sells its oil to Europe and to China and Japan and has a chokehold on the world economy thanks to America enforcing all of their wars. When we went to war in Iraq, we performed what was known as SAD, Strategic Area Denial. We dusted Iraq with depleted uranium, enough depleted uranium to radiate Iraq with the equivalent of 44,000 Hiroshima-sized atomic bombs going off in Iraq. We totally radiated it so no one can ever get oil out of there again without spending trillions of dollars to detoxify it. It'd be for maybe centuries, conceivably, it won't be worth it to get the oil out of Iraq. That took Iraq off the market, functionally forever, so that Saudi Arabia will continue to dominate the world's oil market. If we do the same with Iran, if we wind up closing the Straits of Hormuz, pronounced Hormuz in English, say the USS Enterprise. The USS Enterprise has 8 nuclear reactors, 6 to 8 nuclear reactors. And that thing's 50 years old. It's a floating Fukushima. It's in the Strait of Hormuz or heading towards it as we speak. If that gets sunk, which is quite easy because they held a series of war games known as Operation Millennium Challenge, and they pulled a Marine Corps general out of retirement, and they asked him to play the part of the enemy with only third world weapons, speedboats, pleasure cruisers. And he chose as his primary weapon Chinese silkworm missiles. To put this into perspective for you, the Chinese silkworm missile was designed by a Chinese American who was so persecuted here due to racism that he defected to communist China, and he designed the silkworm missile. A woman who wrote a book on that was Iris Chang. Everybody knows her for writing that anti-Japanese book, The Rape of Nanking. Mm-hmm. Well, Iris Chang wrote a book called The Trail of the Silkworm, and after that she was found dead in her car, and they said she committed suicide.
Yeah, that seems to be the going excuse. Everybody commits suicide, you know.
Well, I hear you. Well, this silkworm missile used in these war games, this retired Marine Corps general named Van Ripper, last name was spelled V-A-N-R-I-P-E-R, he took down the USS Enterprise and the entire carrier task force using nothing but pleasure cruisers and speedboats and silkworm missiles. He sank all ships, 16 ships. 16 ships. So please don't think it can't be done. So if the USS Enterprise, with its 6 to 8 nuclear reactors, goes down in the Strait of Hormuz, that's, again, you've taken, that's basically almost all of the world's oil comes through that strait. You've changed the world economy. You've effectively shut down the world economy in 24 hours at that point. That's what the Americans want because their Saudi masters demand it so that their Saudi masters can continue to control the world economy of China and Japan and Europe. And so this is the kind of situation that we're confronted with. If you want to know what America's foreign policy is dictated by, you turn to the House of Saud. It's whatever the House of Saud wants. And so in terms of military documents where I dealt with specific titles, the one that brought me to world attention was JB 355, serialized as both 591 and 691 in documentary status to confuse future retrieval attempts. And this was, JB stood for Joint Board, equivalent to today's Joint Chiefs of Staff, and this is where the top war criminals of the 20th century, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who signed off on it, and his original signature was on the documents I destroyed. He and the Secretary of War, Henry Stimson, Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy, James Forrestal was first undersecretary and filled his superior's position upon Frank Knox's death in 1944. General Hap Arnold of the U.S. Army Air Corps. All of these criminals got together and conspired to make war. This is exactly what the United States prosecuted Axis national heads of state for in 1945 through 1946. That's an example of one of the documents that I dealt with. Another one would have been the Fugu Plan, the Japanese relocation of tens of thousands, ultimately hundreds of thousands, and ultimately 1 million Jews to Birobidzhan, what today is known as the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, a buffer state between Manchuria, today northern China, and the former Soviet Union, today the Russian Federation. And this buffer state's still there today. People can look that up on the map, and the Jewish Autonomous Oblast, but it's only there if you look it up. It's not published on any single American manufactured map. And it's one of those unrecognized nations that actually has borders, and it was invaded by the Soviets at the end of 1945 and occupied by them until the collapse of the Soviet Union. So these Fugu documents, in which this state had been instated through a series of wars between Japan and the Soviet Union, 1937, 1938, and 1939, one war each year, where the Japanese won the territory to establish this Jewish nation state. The first Israel before Israel existed in the Mediterranean. National language was Yiddish. These were 10 volumes of onion skin paper documents marked Maruhai, or top secret in Japanese. And I destroyed all of them. So we're talking about enormously important historical documents that were never released to the public or to academia. But without dwelling too much on World War II itself, I'd like to start right now, with your permission, on what led up to it in Asian-Pacific relations, going back to right after the American Civil War, because I don't want the general public to think that we're stuck in this 20th century on World War II, because there's so much more to our history that people don't understand the roots of our corruption. I'd like to get into that right now, with your permission. Is that all right, Mr. Vara?
Absolutely, sir. Please take us in any direction you like.
You're too kind. In 1866, just months after the end of the war between the states, the American Civil War, an American ship that was tellingly named the USS General Sherman ignored Korean demands to turn back, and it took Korean civilians hostage and fired on civilians until the ship was bottled in at the Taedong River, and the entire crew was killed. And exactly half a decade later, in 1871, the United States invaded Korea with 700 Marines and naval infantry sailors. They took the castle, they stormed the castle, they took the Korean king down, and they forced the nation of Korea into protectorate status, and the Kingdom of Korea functionally became a colony of the United States. And this was the first American-Korean War, and nobody even knows about it. But if you were to look this up, you'd find out everything I'm saying is true. Now, all of this was done because of railroad interests and rail barons. People don't understand this, but you could sit on the Korean Peninsula or on a beach in Japan, you could drink a beer facing the Japan Sea, and you can throw that beer can, when you're done with it, in the water, and it's going to float up on a Korean beach. If you're in Korea, you drink a beer or a soda pop, you throw that can in the water, it's going to float up on a Japanese beach. That's how close they are. A healthy man could swim the distance. So they wanted to build a railroad that would connect Tokyo through Korea all the way into Manchuria, ultimately link up with the Trans-Siberian Railway that would go all the way to Moscow and then into Europe. Then they could connect from there up through the Bering Strait, bridge Alaska, and have a railroad that came all the way back down through Canada into the United States. This was their dream, because through this they could control the trade of the world, of all of Pacific Asia. And people don't realize this, but the Civil War was a railroad war. Every single major battle took place within 20 miles of a railroad. And, of course, we all know coal was king, and the rail barons were running the show at that time, people in this day and age don't realize how much. In 1873, the United States went into its first Great Depression. And again, people don't really understand that. And at that time, you had a whole bunch of people who were out of work that the railroad barons wanted to send west to get them out of the cities. And, to give you an example of this, the presidents, Ulysses S. Grant, appointed Durham White Stevens, who was a U.S. diplomat, to the Japanese Empire as an extension of U.S. frontier policy and westward expansion. And Durham White Stevens' father was an educational supervisor of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs from the 1870s to his death in 1890. Durham Stevens began to administer negotiations between the Japanese government and the U.S. rail magnate Edward Harriman, the director of Union Pacific. And Edward Harriman commenced this super project to build a round-the-world railroad controlled by American stockholders. And the South Manchurian Railroad was, at this time, unrealized. It was still the jewel in the Tsar's colonial crown. And in this period of time, they had a whole bunch of people who could work with this because of the depression that was going down. But by the way, sir, I'm going to count on you for adult supervision when we come up on break time or anything like that. So if you've got anything that you want to bring up, don't be afraid to bring it up.
Absolutely. If I feel the need to interrupt, I certainly will. And we've got until the half-hour mark before we hit the break. So you're doing great. Just
great.
Continue.
Thank you so much. Yeah. Well, all of these, to put it in perspective to you about this depression, 1 out of 4 men in the United States had no job at all, while the rest were looking for something that would pay better than 10 cents an hour. And when nighttime came to New York City, 80,000 homeless people would come into police stations to keep warm until the next day. And that means that 1/10 of the nation's greatest city at that time lived in prison, voluntarily or involuntarily. And there'd never been anything like it. And people don't know about it today, but all of these people who were living like this found out that the Homestead Act, which they kept hearing about, which was supposed to be bringing them west, was being used by the big companies to seize land on the frontier. 1,000 acres of fertile ground was staked out by company agents and left nothing but scrub for the family farmer. And this is when America's government began to fly a pirate flag. Basically, everything that was started just 100 years before in 1776, it died in 1876. Because what happened was Samuel Tilden, who was the, good God, who's that guy I keep thinking of who's the Democrat, Ralph Nader. Samuel Tilden was the Ralph Nader of his day. And he was a famous fighter of corruption in the country. He was elected president. I bet you've never heard of him. He was elected president. Yeah, he was elected president by 250,000 votes on November 7th, 1876. And in electoral votes, he won 196 to 173 over General Rutherford Hayes of the military-industrial complex, the Republican candidate. And the spoils machine went to work. In Florida, a mass shipment of cash wrapped in threats went to the vote returning boards, and the votes of the Democratic precincts were disallowed. And keep in mind, I'm a political atheist when it comes to domestic politics. I can slam down on both Democrats and Republicans and their representatives totally easily. But here
you and me both.
Yes. I mean, it's like pro wrestling. That's
what it is.
Yeah, they've got a preset winner, and it's just there to really entertain you. But it's not a real fight. But at this point in history, this is how it became like that. And the chairman of the board admitted everything about this later when a promised appointment didn't come through for him. But by then it was too late. Florida had 4 electoral votes. The same combination worked in Louisiana on November 8th. Louisiana had 8 electoral votes. And Tilden still had 250,000 votes more. But the switches made Hayes, the general, president. They called him president-select. 185 electoral votes to 184. He won by 1 vote through corruption. With a little finesse, and in plain sight, the presidency of the United States was stolen.
And it has been ever since, pretty much, hasn't it?
Yeah. There was talk about a rebellion to save the nation's honor. And the publisher of the Louisville Courier-Journal, a Republican, printed a call for 100,000 men to defend the Capitol. And rumors spread about camps of soldiers in Washington waiting for just such a popular protest. but all this talk of rebellion ended because everybody was too busy trying to feed themselves because the Depression kept them from rebelling. And that's the kind of pirate flag that's been flying over this republic because of the Depression that was going on then. And think of how close that is to what we're dealing with right now. And but in 1879, right after that, Ed Harriman's Union Pacific was prepared to build this round-the-world railroad as America's supersessor to the British Cape to Cairo Railway of Cecil Rhodes fame. And it was deemed so important to the plans of U.S. global dominance that President Ulysses S. Grant became the first president to visit Japan. And at that time, in 1883, Durham White Stevens, who I just brought up, he resigned his post as the American legation in Tokyo under direct executive orders and entered the Japanese Diplomatic Corps. Now think of what I'm talking about. A big, strapping, football player-sized Caucasian becomes a member of the Japanese Diplomatic Corps in 1883 to serve as secretary to the Japanese legation in Washington, D.C. So he's a representative of a foreign nation in his own nation's capital. And in 1884, Durham Stevens was selected. He was established as Japan's representative in Korea under orders of the President of the United States to facilitate the interests of the American railroad lobby. And in 1889, President Benjamin Harrison began the Spanish-American War, and the Americans conquered the 7,100 islands of the Philippines. And at that time, General Jacob W. Smith ordered U.S. troops, take no prisoners. I want all persons killed who are capable of bearing arms against the United States. And this was to be interpreted to mean anyone, male or female, over the age of 10 was considered an enemy combatant and was exterminated as such. And this guerrilla war in the Catholic North alone resulted in no less than 60,000 summary on-the-spot executions, 200,000 battle deaths, and 2 million people left homeless in Luzon and its regional archipelago environs alone. And in the Muslim-dominated archipelago regions around Mindanao, things really started to get serious. Now, there was a huge Japanese community that had been there for hundreds of years in Davao. As a matter of fact, if you remember Officer Sulu, played by George Takei in the Star Trek franchise,
yes,
he was of Japanese ethnicity, but his name was Sulu. He was named after the Central Sea in the Philippine archipelago because Gene Roddenberry wanted to portray him as someone who was descended from the Japanese colony that had been there for hundreds of years in the Islamic-dominated area of the Philippines. So Gene Roddenberry knew his history far more than most of the people who were watching his series. And this Japanese community in Davao began to report to the Japanese home islands of unprecedented modern magnitude of the American genocide, which would overwhelm even the Armenian Holocaust of World War I. Basically, what the Americans did was they did exactly what they would do later on with the Flying Tigers. And with the Flying Tigers, they created an illegal American mercenary wing that was basically fighting the Japanese from 1937 on in mainland China. And to put this into perspective for you about basically why they're criminals, they were defined under sections 956 through 960 of the United States Criminal Code, which legally restricts collusive aggressive activity and forbids conspiracies to injure the property of any foreign state, the hiring or retaining of persons within the United States, whence all the American Volunteer Group, a.k.a. the Flying Tigers source from, for enlistment in any foreign military service and the furnishing of money for any military enterprise against the territory of any foreign state. So not only was the AVG, or the American Volunteer Group, under General Claire Chennault, the Flying Tigers, not only were they criminals by our own domestic definition, they were criminals by international law under the League of the United Nations, of which the United States was the primary founding member. So anyone who thinks of these people as heroes has to remember that they're criminals. And they weren't there to help the Chinese at all. They were there to facilitate the opium trade using Douglas DC-3s and Douglas DC-4s known in an organization known as CNAC, China National Aviation Corporation. This was the precursor to the CIA Airlines Air America. And that's why they were there, was to escort these airborne drug shipments which the Japanese Empire was trying to interdict. Now, the precursor to that, in this first overseas Vietnam that the Americans was fighting in the Philippines, the precursor to that was the Filipino Scouts. And the original Filipino Scouts weren't Filipino at all. They were all American soldiers and Marines, just like the Flying Tigers were all American naval aviators, Marine Corps aviators, or Army aviators. And the Filipino Scouts in this war were all Marines or soldiers who were given a higher rate of pay and a more rapid rate of advancement if they volunteered for extermination units against the Muslim Filipinos. And I destroyed thousands of photos of what they did. They wiped out entire villages, and they would take their cannon and surround a village and just pound it into the ground. Then they would take all the bodies and put them into lime pits that they had forced the survivors to dig. Then they would execute the survivors. And they would take these pits and cover them in lime so that they would disintegrate immediately in the tropical heat, so they would prevent plague. And by the end of this campaign, which was 3 to 5 years long, they had killed 3 million Muslims. And what people don't tell you today is that Timothy McVeigh's partner, Terry Nichols, when they took on the Oklahoma City Murrah Federal Building, or whatever the name of it was, forgive me, I forget, but I know it as the Oklahoma City bombing, and I do forget the name of the specific federal building, and perhaps someone can remind me of that. But when they took it down, or a big part of it, what people don't tell you is that they executed McVeigh immediately. You remember that. Terry Nichols, of course, Terry Nichols is in a concrete hole. He's going to be in a concrete hole the rest of his life. Everybody wants to interview him. He's begging to be interviewed. What they don't tell you is his wife was a Muslim Filipina. And he found out all about this Holocaust. Another person like that was Bobby Fischer. Bobby Fischer stood up when the Twin Towers collapsed and were taken down. He said, "America deserves it." And everybody said, what a heinous villain. What an evil man. What a lunatic. Well, they didn't realize he was married to a Muslim Filipina. And he had been told about this hidden history that no American knows about.
I see.
Now in 1901, September 11th, 1901, exactly 100 years to the day before 9/11 Twin Towers attack, a Catholic Filipino northerner, Leon Cholgos, assassinated the President of the United States, William McKinley, in direct retribution for the slaughter of Filipino civilians. And Teddy Roosevelt, who succeeded to the presidency, the first thing he said was, "Oh, the guy's dark and he's swarthy. He's a Mediterranean wog." He was trying to imply he was Italian or Greek. And he said, "Oh, he's a communist. He's a Bolshevik." And he instantly directed attention away from the war in the Philippines. And they went to work so heavily on this that if you look up Leon Cholgos in Wikipedia or any American online encyclopedia, I can bet you bottom dollar you're going to find some misinformation that he was some Polish Bolshevik. They went so far as to give him this entirely false family line. He was executed immediately, so he couldn't talk. And I'll tell you why I know what I know was because Durham White Stevens, the man who was put in charge of Korea, he was ultimately assassinated by Koreans right here in San Francisco. And they based their entire assassination strategy on Leon Cholgos' assassination strategy that he used to take down McKinley. And that's how I got a hold of the San Francisco Police Department records while working as a librarian for the Department of Defense, because those PD records, SFPD records, were actually in the DOD records because the Department of Defense was comparing the assassination to the takedown of McKinley. And those records stayed there in the DOD possession till the day that I destroyed them. And I know the truth.
Okay, Douglas, let's hold it right there, and let's pick it back up when we come back from this break. Just a unbelievable amount of information. And again, I bet none of you remember learning this history in school, do you? Yeah, and you never will either. You're going to hear it on shows like this, Late Night in the Midlands. Wow, that's all I could say. Wow, just unbelievable information. Who knew that deception went that far back and that deep? Just unbelievable. Well, we're going to take this quick break, folks, and then we're going to come back and talk some more. And in the last hour, I will open up lines Just so much fascinating information. I mean, I'm sitting back just like you all are, thinking, wow. I'm Michael Vara. This is Late Night in the Midlands on Radio N-Search, and we'll be back in just a few minutes. Welcome, everybody. If you've tuned in late, well, you're going to want to go back to the archives and listen to this one. Douglas Dietrich is our guest, and wow, what a fantastic information we're getting here. And when I say fantastic, I don't mean yay. I'm glad it's that way. But I'm glad that there's people out there who are spreading the truth and are putting their necks on the line to get the truth to you. So get over to latenightinthemidlands.com and project.nsearch.com and nsearch.com. Become members, be informed. Listen live and chat. Most of all, share the truth. That's why we open our websites and open these mics every single night for you, because we want to give you the truth, and the mainstream, lamestream media is never going to tell you any of this. So let's get back to it with our guest. All right, Douglas, we're back, and you could pick right back up where you left off. Just fantastic information. It's mind-blowing.
I appreciate your patience and the patience of the audience, and I also appreciate that their interest is historical, because everything that's happening today, the postmodern world, is formed by what I'm talking about. And in 1904, the Russo-Japanese War took place. Japan's prize at the end of that war was the acquisition of the South Manchurian Railroad, and once it was realized, Japan commenced reestablishment of the Manchurian Imperial Dynasty. And at that time, in July 1905, the Secretary of War, a Republican by the name of William Howard Taft, former U.S. Commissioner to the Philippines and future President and Supreme Court Justice, he cut a secret deal with Taro Katsura, Japan's foreign minister, to realize the Union Pacific Worldwide Railway through mutual Japanese-American co-development of Korea. And at that time, the Republican Roosevelt, who had seceded after McKinley, who had been taken down by a Filipino assassin, Theodore Roosevelt won a Nobel Peace Prize for negotiating the Treaty of Portsmouth that ended the Russo-Japanese War. And in September of 1905, approved the secret Taft-Katsura Agreement that enforced joint administrative protectorate status under Japanese-American codominium to be imposed on Korea's feuding, squabbling dynasty. Durham White Stevens was appointed by the Japanese government through America's behest as the foreign advisor to Korean King Kojong, who was a puppet at that point. Now, in Durham Stevens' New York Times obituary of 4 years later, when he was taken down in San Francisco, where I live today, neighbors with the satanic chaplain of the United States Army, Colonel Michael Aquino, retired, the New York Times obituary stated about Durham White Stevens that his post was of such importance that he became known throughout Asia as the American dictator of Korea. And in 1908, in 1906, we remember the great earthquake and fire of San Francisco. And at that time, the population of San Francisco was 20 times larger than that of Los Angeles. And it was so important an outlet to the Pacific, as I've mentioned before with the Presidio military base at the opening of our discussion, that expansion into Asia was happening only through San Francisco. It truly was the Embarcadero, the Golden Gate, the gateway to the Pacific. And because of that, they created this huge lie that it wasn't the earthquake that killed thousands of people, about 20,000 in San Francisco. They created the lie that it was a fire. I want you to know that's pure propaganda, because all the survivors had to be reestablished in the 1,500 acres of the Presidio military base. So I dealt with all the records and all the documents. And it wasn't the fire that did all the damage and the killing. It was the earthquake. But Roosevelt couldn't let anybody know that, because then nobody would want to move back to San Francisco. So the Japanese, who had just finished a devastating war with Russia from 1904 through 1905, helped to give millions of dollars. And they were an impoverished third world nation at the time, to help rebuild San Francisco because they needed American trade. And you know how the Americans responded? On October 11th, the San Francisco School Board introduced the Segregation Act to keep Japanese out of American schools.
Wow.
And in 1908, the Koreans had the Righteous Army Rebellion. A group of former Korean soldiers who had originally been trained by the Japanese were cashiered by the machinations of Durham Stevens, who didn't trust the native population due to the Korean history of resistance to American encroachment. They shot their way out of Seoul, the capital of South Korea, and Japanese soldiers were in hot pursuit. This touched off a revolt that was ultimately aided by students, peasants, and bandits. The rebels took the offensive, got within 8 miles of Seoul before the Japanese wiped them out in a series of engagements that killed about 14,000 Koreans and left about 160 Japanese dead. And the leader of the Righteous Army in Korea issued a message to Koreans living abroad: compatriots, we must unite, consecrate ourselves to our land, restore our independence, and do our best to kill the American masters. And so on March 21st in 1908, while he was in San Francisco on a mission of economic maneuvering, Durham White Stevens was conducting an interview with San Francisco newspapers, and he said that the Koreans will undergo the same fate that the United States is perpetrating on the Philippines, basically advocating genocide. And it was very shortly after that he was taken down in front of San Francisco's Ferry Building. So when he was taken down by these two Korean assassins, they used pistols that were covered in bandages on their hands, pretending that their arms were broken, and this was the same tactic that had been used by Leon Cholgaz, the Filipino assassin who had taken down President McKinley. So he was brought to San Francisco Harbor Emergency Hospital after they shot him, and he died. And on March 24th, 1908, the San Francisco Chronicle wrote, 3 shots will be heard around the world, because he was killed with 3 shots, rang out yesterday morning. And they were fired from the revolver of Chong In-wan, confessed assassin and avowed patriot of Korea. 2 bullets pierced the body of Durham White Stevens, an American advisor of the Korean Council of State. In Korea, the story of the shooting will be heard by a captive people with fanatic praise. And the bandage pistolier, Chung Moon-ong, was charged with being an accessory to murder. He was released from prison in June 1908, a scant few months later, and he fled the country. Chung In-wan was convicted of a second-degree manslaughter and sentenced to 25 years in San Quentin, but he was paroled after 10 years at the end of World War I. He returned home and was celebrated as a national hero by the Korean population in 1918. Now, that's a strange story for you.
Yeah, I'd say.
And in 1909, tragically, a year after Stephen's death, Hirobimi Ito, the Bismarck of Japan, a peasant-turned-samurai who had written Japan's modern constitution and devised its counter-aggressive foreign policy to overturn the American encirclement of Asia, basically, he was an advocate of a pan-Asiatic Monroe Doctrine. And he was gunned down by Korean assassins as he disembarked from a train in Harbin, Manchuria. And so Ito's last speech advocated a joint Japanese-Korean effort to develop Manchuria using Western technology instead of American industrial oversight, because he was afraid of the expansion of Russia into Asian territory. And terribly, when he was assassinated, that led to the kind of Korean and Japanese hostilities that are still tainting their relations today. But you might say, well, what's that all got to do with us today? And I brought up on national radio before the story of George Bush Sr. and how he served, apparently honorably enough, in World War II as a torpedo pilot. I don't know if you remember it, and if you do, I'd appreciate your relating it to the audience, or do you want me to kind of go over it because it leads directly into what happened with him?
Please go over it. Sure.
Yeah. Well, George Bush Sr., as a torpedo pilot, it's got to be known that torpedo pilots sink ships, whereas fighter pilots are the best of all pilots, and they engage each other in tactical dogfights. So there's a saying amongst naval aviators that fighter pilots make movies, but torpedo pilots make history. And naval aviators are the best in the world of any nation, because a naval aviator has to be able to land on a postage-sized moving deck in high winds, under any condition. And there's no normal pilot that can do that. That's why you're insulting a naval aviator tremendously if you refer to them as a pilot. So please never do that and pay them the respect they deserve for their skills. But in terms of George Bush's case, during that period of time in World War II, they had used a submarine campaign to starve out Japanese islands. And believe it or not, most Americans don't know this, the vast majority of Japanese islands held in the Pacific were never invaded. The Americans chose to starve them out because the fighting was just too tremendous, and they felt most of them were not of strategic value for what they were aiming for, which was the bombing of the home islands, as opposed to any military objective. And so they tried to starve these out by sinking all merchant shipping. And they dealt a tremendous amount of damage to Japanese merchant shipping, and left these islands isolated. Now, the majority of Japanese, all Japanese, before the ceasefire in World War II, were vegetarians. They didn't eat meat in Japan. The closest thing they came to it was fish. But because they were so starving, many Japanese soldiers on these islands had to revert to cannibalism. So they wound up eating a lot of American prisoners of war. Now, there was a radar island the Japanese had radar, which most Americans are totally unaware of. There was a radar station island that where they were starving, and whenever naval aviators got shot down, they would bring them into the island and throw them in a pit and use a samurai sword to basically dismember them one limb at a time to keep them alive, because they had to keep the body alive to keep the meat fresh. And by the time they got to the fourth limb, then they would kill the individual and eat the rest of them. Now, this was the kind of fate that was in store for George Bush Sr., because he got shot down near this radar station island. And the Japanese were rowing out to pick him up for a feast. And that's when a submarine happened to be in an American submarine. By the way, the Americans were so wealthy, they had so much unlimited wealth, they had an entire submarine program that was dedicated to doing nothing but picking up downed pilots. Down naval aviators.
That's amazing.
And he was lucky enough where one had known about his being shot down. They surfaced just in time, opened up their machine guns, and the Japanese rowed away. He was brought onto the deck of that submarine. There's actual footage of him being brought onto the deck of the submarine. And so he was rescued. Years later, when he's president of the United States, and he's eating dinner with the Japanese prime minister, he's sitting across the table, and the Japanese guy across the table says to him, "Hey, we were just rowing out to pick you up when that submarine surfaced." And that's when he turned around and vomited on the Japanese prime minister's lap.
Wow.
I don't know if you remember that, but that was on international television.
Yeah, I do remember. Faintly, I do remember it, yes.
But nobody knew the backstory behind that. But
no.
The end result is George Bush Sr. was, of course, in charge of the CIA. And while he was in charge of the CIA, during the Korean War, he worked with opening up basically a branch office in Korea. And to show you how bad it is, the American occupation of Korea that's been going on, as you know now, since the end of the American Civil War, the Korean CIA is literally named that, KCIA, Korean CIA. That's how slave-circuited they are in terms of American occupation. And it was while he was opening up this branch office, the KCIA, and you can look this up. You can do research on it, say, what's the Korean branch of intelligence? And you're not going to even find a Korean name for it. It just literally says KCIA, Korean CIA. While he was opening up this branch office, he ran into an ardent anti-communist, Reverend Sun Myung Moon of the Moonies, the famous Moonie cult. And Reverend Sun Myung Moon converted George Bush Sr. Now, everybody in Asia knows this. And if you talk to anybody in Asia about George Bush Sr., they'll say, "Oh, yeah, the Moonie president." You talk to anybody in the United States, and nobody knows this.
Wow.
And to put this into perspective for you, I'm sorry, go on.
Mm-hmm. Oh, no, go ahead.
Yeah, to put this into perspective for you, Reverend Sun Myung Moon is, of course, the owner of multiple industries based on the massive income from his cult, which has international following. And all industries, by law, in South Korea, which is still legally at war with North Korea, and the Americans are still in occupation of South Korea as part of the United Nations mandate enforcing the United Nations peacekeeping, the Panmunjom talks, the North Korean, South Korean peace treaty talks you keep hearing about, they're still ongoing from the time of the Korean War. What you have in Korea is a ceasefire. The war is still legally ongoing.
That's right.
And Americans who are in occupation of Korea will get involved in ship-to-ship skirmishes with the North Korean Navy. They'll be involved in firefights across the Northern Korean demilitarized zone. Every once in a while, a couple dozen Americans die. Every one of them is flown home in a coffin covered by a United Nations flag, because it's still a United Nations peacekeeping action. And they're counted as United Nations casualties. So you'll never hear of American fatalities in Korea.
Oh, wow. Nice cover-up right there. The United Nations, I think that is the empire of evil, if I have ever seen it. And, I get a little concerned. I mean, our president, Obama, decided to go to the United Nations and skip right over Congress. And apparently he's allowed to, undeclared, of course, but he's allowed to go war with anybody he wants as long as it's not called a war. It's okay.
Well, that's been the case ever since the end of the Second World War. A lot of people don't realize that. That's a totally different story. I've gone into that before on many different stations and programs. I'll be happy to do it here. We might not cover it tonight, but we'll certainly cover it if the questions come up concerning that. But to kind of finish this off about George Bush Sr., because it's so important, to put Reverend Sung Myung Moon in perspective for you, because North Korea and South Korea are still legally at war, it's required by law that every industry in South Korea manufacture weapons. So Reverend Sung Myung Moon is the leader of the only church in the world that's required by its government, because it's incorporated, to manufacture weapons. So his church manufactures its own weapons. And he purchased the Washington Post. He owned the Washington Post for years. Well over a decade, he's one of the men responsible for George Bush Sr. becoming president. So all the while that George Bush Sr. was president, you had a Moonie in power, and you didn't even know it, in the United States. And he used to be quite public about it. He never hid it. By the way, President George Bush Sr. or former President George Bush Sr., all the while he was executive, all the while after he was retired from executive status, never once kept this hidden. He was quite vocal about it. He would speak about it on air, and he would say, Reverend Sung Myung Moon is the manifestation of God on earth. He's the man with a vision because he is beyond mankind. He is God manifest. And he would visit Korea on a pilgrimage to Sung Myung Moon, and he would basically bow and kiss this guy's feet physically about maybe once a year. And this was on Korean television nationally. This was on Japanese television. And Americans would never write this up. They would never speak of it. He actually went down to open up Reverend Moon's vision of a Jonestown in South America. There was this Amazon colony that was opened up. And who was the man who did the opening ceremonies? George Bush Sr.
Wow. Yeah, a lot of rituals with these guys. It's like Bohemian Grove. They like to do their little rituals around the owl.
Well, you would think that the Democratic Party would use this to their advantage and do some mudslinging, but it really goes to show you the level of cooperation between the Democrats and the Republicans. A two-party republic offers no choice. And
that's right. Headlocks in the ring, and then while they're in headlocks, they're whispering in each other's ears, where do you want to go for dinner after the match?
Yes. No, very much so. Mm-hmm. And so that, I hope that all of this, just in some small way, puts into perspective for people what we were contending with. And by the way, just a few historical facts to kind of round out what I was saying about 1877, that year that our republic started to fly a pirate flag, as far as I'm concerned. The population of the United States was 40 million people, or rather 40 million Caucasians, and 100,000 Indians that the United States Army proceeded to sweep away in its own domestic Vietnam. And at that time, shortly after the American Civil War, the American Frontier Army began, and I dealt with the documents for many years, a process of Indian extermination that resulted in one battle or massacre a week up until shortly before World War I. That really ought to tell you something. That's something akin to 14,000 extermination skirmishes. And every day, the fatality tallies would be read in American cities, just like they used to give body counts for the Vietnam War. And it was just like Vietnam because Geronimo and the other Indian leaders used to escape into Mexico, cross the border, or escape into Canada, cross the border, and the Americans couldn't follow them because that'd be violating an international boundary, and then the Indians would come back and fight them. This is how you resulted in America's first anti-guerrilla warfare special units.
Now, what was the casualty numbers there? I mean, obviously you don't know for sure, do you? with the Native Americans?
It was an extermination of basically, if I remember correctly, about 100,000. That's why I mentioned the number that I did. They were swept aside by the United States Army. Very few left after that of any consequence in terms of numbers. And again, to put this into perspective for you, the Americans were reading these body counts every day in the papers in the cities, and they all thought that was great. And if you want to know why Americans are so callous to the casualty statistics coming out of Korea, coming out of Vietnam, coming out of Iraq, coming out of Afghanistan, they've got a whole history of this going back to the slaughter of the American Indians, where they would just read statistics every day and say, oh, that's nice. They are probably the most desensitized, calloused people on the face of the earth. And when you're confronted with this, as a culture, you have to say that how can you point your fingers at other cultures when we have to contend with what we have to here? Our entire culture needs to be redefined. And we've got to realize the fact that we are a culture of constant chronic genocide. And we've been confronted with presidents. Now, to give you an example, you speak of Bohemian Grove. Geronimo was the great Indian resistance fighter. When he was finally slaughtered on the field of battle, Prescott Bush Sr., who was a cavalry officer, went into his tent. I dealt with the documents. I burned them. And he sawed his head off as a fraternity prank. He took that skull and he brought it back to the Skull and Bones Club, his fraternity, and they made that their mascot. And by their own words, this was the term on the documents, part of their initiation rituals to swear in new members of the fraternity is skull fucking. And they finger this skull and swear upon it to enter into the Skull and Bones Club, and they say, Geronimo! That's why the OSS, the Office of Secret Services, which was a bunch of rich white frat boys who were parachuting behind the lines in Asia and in the Balkans and Europe, these guys used to jump off their planes, and they were fraternity members of Skull and Bones. They used to shout, Geronimo! That's where that all comes from.
Absolutely sick. Just absolutely sick. I mean, it's all a lie. It's like, everything that they've told us, everything they see on the fake news, just all a lie. Hang on there for a minute, Douglas. We've got to take another break here. When we come back, we'll pick right back up. And everyone, sorry about the F-bomb, but hey, that's what they call it, right? I'm Michael Vara. This is Late Night in the Midlands on Radio Answer. All right, Douglas, we're moving right along here, so wherever you'd like to take us next.
Well, what I'd like to emphasize is the fact that I'm really looking forward to the phone calls and the questions that the audience has to field, and I really appreciate their interest in stuff that a lot of people consider irrelevant, but I hope you realize that it's not. Keep in mind the dates that I've given. 1876 was when this individual took over the United States, this member of the military-industrial complex, General Rutherford Hayes, and we're talking about exactly 100 years after the American Revolution in 1776. And when I speak of President William McKinley being taken down by a Filipino assassin on September 11th, 1901, exactly 100 years to the day before the 9/11 terrorist attacks, which had everything to do with Islam and its vengeance against the West. I hope this begins to put it into perspective for everyone, the continuity here of the criminal empire which the United States has come to represent. And I want you all to look at it from a positive perspective. And at first that's going to sound funny or even strange, but I tell Americans of European descent that there were Russians long before there was a constitutional entity, a corrupt constitutional entity, a monstrous constitutional entity known as the Soviet Union. And with the collapse of that Soviet Union, even though they're flirting with extinction, and that takes some explaining, but believe me when I tell you that that's the case, there are still Russians today. And just as there were Russians before there was a Soviet Union, there were Americans hundreds of years before there was the United States. Not just the original indigenous peoples, but also European-descended Americans who landed at Plymouth Rock 200 years before there was a 1776 revolution and the institution of the constitutional entity we call the United States. And there will be Americans of that European descent after the collapse and dissolution of that corrupt constitutional entity known as the United States. There's no need for revolution. There's no need for violence. It's basically running itself to the ground. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but I'm always deathly afraid that people will take that as some kind of justification to try to incite violence. I'm sure you understand my concern in that.
Oh, absolutely, and it's I who didn't mean to interrupt you. By all means, continue. And when you're ready, we do have a couple people on the phone lines, but we've still got about another 45 minutes to go here. So if you got more that you'd like to add in to that, by all means, go ahead.
Oh, absolutely. What were you going to say first, though? I definitely want to hear what was on your mind at the time, or what that brought to your mind when I was talking about the Americans before and after the Constitution, so to speak, or the entity that the Constitution supposedly represents, which is the United States. Of course, the Constitution's been amended so many times, I don't know if it's the same document that we started off with.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, no, I was just going to let you know that we did have a couple callers on the line, and that's pretty much it. But yeah, they act like Columbus discovered America, and no, he did not. There was people here long before that. So
and that
I agree.
Yeah, and that includes Caucasians, by the way. That includes the Vikings or the Vikings, depending on your pronunciation with a Scandinavian dialect, and Kennewick Man, who was obviously a Caucasian who apparently was thousands of years old. Probably crossed here during the time of the Great Ice Age, just by following the ice flows that were in the North Atlantic, literally feeling their whatever canoes or kayaks that they were using, feeling their ways, alongside the ice walls, is what some people speculate in terms of how he got here, so to speak. Before we get to the callers, I'd like to emphasize, in terms of personal appearances, as scheduled thus far, I'll be delivering the premier public presentation of the astrobiology of God at the 2012 summit. That's going to be in Northern California's Trinity United Methodist Church in Mountain View, California on Saturday, May 12th of this year. And my initial screening of these explosive subject materials were before a limited private audience before. But I speak of the exact reason why we have to contend with the reality of a divinity, and what in Asia is known as manifest divinity, and in the West is known as intelligent design. My first publicly released book, The Reality of the Red Undead, The Untold True Story of the Supernatural Soviets, is intended to premiere via convention exclusive at the 12th Annual 2012 Conspiracy Con, and that's produced by the world-renowned conventioneer Brian William Hall, convening on-site California Santa Clara Marriott on the weekend of June 2nd through the 3rd. And this year has such keynote speakers as George Norrie and Brian Sussman, who need no introduction. I myself have been officially scheduled as a specially featured guest with my own table for public accessibility, interview availability, personal conversation, and autography. And I'm most certainly anticipating delivering the opening presentation on militant Luciferism, American demonolatry in the U.S. criminal state, the first event of its kind at the Super Soldier Summit, #1. And it's produced by my executrix, Lorian Fenton, convening in California's Marin County on Saturday, June 23rd of this year, and to establish and maintain a modicum of personal security for all of our speakers and any attendees. The precise location of venue is not going to be disclosed except to those who purchase tickets. And finally, my next book, Roswell and the Rising Sun, about the Roswell incident, and my speaking to this. The reason this is so poignant for me, and I do want to devote just a moment to it here, was because I gave my original presentation on Roswell and the Rising Sun on the last Saturday of the first month of last year, January 29th of 2011. And that's where I exposed the Roswell debris that I had absconded with from the Presidio military base, and when I worked with the Roswell documents. And I had originally given this to the Japanese anonymously back in 1995. There's an entire story behind that. It changed the world economy at the time because Roswell was a war crime. Japan and America were still legally at war. Ceasefire was declared in 1946 per Title 38 of the U.S. Code, which is law, as established by Congress. Title 30 of the U.S. Code states that ceasefire between Japan and America ended proactive hostilities of World War II on December 31st of 1946. You can look that up. Nothing was conveyed on the USS Missouri. You had a flag flying over that ceremony that was backwards, had 31 stars, the transposition of the number 13, and every single one of those stars on that flag was upside down. You can check the photographs. This isn't a negative reversal. There's no negative reversal in the world that turns specific elements in inversion. It is backwards.
Amazing.
All the stars are upside down. That's exactly the flag, the way they wanted it, because it was a misrepresentation of a fake ceremony. It lasted 18 minutes, and the Japanese officers on that battleship Missouri, you'll notice none of them have any samurai swords to surrender. There was no conclusion of peace at that time. I could go into that for hours, onto the legality of that. You can look this up yourself. Japanese-American Peace Treaty wasn't signed until September 8th, 1951, by Prime Minister Shigeru Yoshida, as the plenipotentiary representing the Japanese Emperor, came to the Presidio military base of San Francisco and signed a peace treaty with the United States, September 8th, 1951. You can look that up. I destroyed the records. And you can look up whatever information is still floating around out there, and you'll find out everything I'm saying is true. And
fascinating.
And what had happened in terms of this Roswell debris, because people don't understand that at the end of World War II, the Americans had an enormous amount of prisoners. They had no less than 425,000 German prisoners of war, 53,000 Italians, 5,000 Japanese, 10,000 Koreans, and Taiwanese. People don't understand this, but Japan is a multi-ethnic empire, and it had Okinawan units, Korean units, and Taiwanese units, just the way the British Empire had Welsh Guards, Scots Guards, and Irish Guards fighting its wars. And all of these Japanese prisoner of war camps in the United States, which had all of these 5,000 Japanese, 5,000 Taiwanese, 5,000 Koreans, they opened up in California, Fort Tracy, Camp Cochran, Camp Bakersfield, Camp Lamont. They didn't open up until 1945. And those Japanese and Taiwanese and Koreans, they never went home. And if you want to know why the Koreans and the Vietnamese never returned any American prisoners of war, it's because of the American policy of not returning any Asians. And those men were tortured and kept here to die for the rest of their lives. And in terms of this war crime and atrocity, they were using them to try and pilot unconventional aerial weapons. That's what happened over Roswell. I had the debris which proved it. And what had happened was when I turned it over to the Japanese people, we announced it on national television. I dealt with Teleport USA, which was a Japanese affiliate between Hakui City, H-A-Q-U-I. You can look that up. Hakui City in Japan was going to open up the Cosmo Isle UFO Museum. And so what had happened was it was around November 17th of 1995 that Ken Schramm's town meeting, which was based in Seattle, Washington. It was a popular television show. UFO researcher Robert Dean announced that the UFO Museum was going to open up in Japan in 1996. They'd already sunk over $50 million into it. Colin Andrews was a British UFO researcher that talked about it opening up in early July of 1996. We had a whole tourist package for a convention of ufologists to speak at and everything else, and they were going to expose this American war crime. And in response, William Jefferson Clinton slapped the toughest trade sanctions on Japan that had ever been imposed in post-war history in order to protect the hides of a bunch of senior American war criminals from the time of World War II who had participated in this atrocity. And the Japanese, they divested in the United States, and they revested in China. And that's how the Made in China boom got started. And people don't understand, at that time, as a disinformation campaign on April 18th of 1996, while we were trying to campaign for this Hakui City UFO Museum, Art Bell received Art's parts. This was the exact same type of debris that I had taken with from the Roswell files. They were sent to him by the United States Air Force and Army, and they had a disinformation letter saying that these were all extraterrestrial materials. And on May 19th of 1996, he had Linda Moulton Howe test them with electron dispersion spectroscopy, and that could tell whether it's from space or not, because we're all made of the same star stuff, so every solar system has the same ingredients you'll find here on Earth, but to different degrees, like a fingerprint. That's how we can tell when a meteorite comes from outer space that's been sitting around for millions of years, or whether it's terrestrial. And that electron dispersion spectroscopy proved it was all pure Japanese aluminum that Art Bell had a hold of. And, people since that time don't realize it about the immense effect this had on international relations. And the end result was that, it basically led to an enormous amount of America's inability to it led America into a depression. And people don't understand that it was Japanese investments after World War II that kept the American economy of the 1980s booming. And when the Japanese turned towards producing producers' goods for China, high technology materials, integrated circuitry, microchips for the manufacturing systems, they are behind the Made in China boom. All the labels saying Made in China ought to say made possible by Japan, because these producers' goods are something you don't see but are important to the world market. That's what Japan turned to, was producers' goods as opposed to consumer goods, which in other words, they upgraded their industry into a post-industrial civilization and left the industrial civilization to China. And that could have been the United States, but this all led to an investment in China instead. Now, because of that, Japan's current account surplus, the widest measure of its trade, which totaled only maybe about $96 billion around the 1990s, it's $196 billion now. It's tripled. And by comparison, America's current account deficit ballooned from $99 billion at that time of the Clinton administration to $471 billion. And, aside from that, the unemployment rate in Japan is only 4.2%, while America's is over twice that much. And from the end of the 1990s up till now, the yen has risen 87% against the U.S. dollar and 94% against the British pound. I mean, this is how much what I'm talking about changed the world as a result of what the Japanese jokingly referred to in their economic circles as the quote-unquote the Roswell crash. And if you went over to Japan, you'd see what I was saying. Aside from the Fukushima Daiichi disaster and catastrophe, that in general, before that period of time, which is one of the major reasons why I am convinced, due to several technological components of that incident, that it was a covert strike by the American military-industrial complex, was because the Japanese quality of life was so high compared to America. And they've been propagandizing for years, saying that, it's so bad over there. Well, if you traveled over there, you wouldn't agree. You would see that the quality of life makes living here in the United States look like hell. The average life expectancy in Japan is it's well over 4 years longer than it is in the United States. It's half a decade longer, as a matter of fact. 5 years longer than most Americans, maybe 4 years longer than most Europeans. I mean, they've made remarkable strides in internet infrastructure. Basically, in all of the cities in the world, when compared, it turns out Japan's internet service is 10 times faster. And aside from all that, I mean, when you go over there, you'll see the cars that they're driving, the clothes that they're wearing, they're better dressed than Americans. Everything they're driving is Audis and Porsches. You would just wonder, how did all this happen when they keep telling us that they've been in a recession or a depression for all these years? You'll notice at the moment you get out of the airport, the American infrastructural decay around Kennedy or Dulles just hits the eye like a ghetto. You land at a Japanese airport, and it looks like you're landing in Johnny Sacco robot from the future kind of complex. I mean, this is how different it is over there. And the Chinese bilateral trade, by the way, remains in broad balance. It's increased its exports from Japan to China have increased 14-fold since that 1995 Roswell incident, meaning the Hockley City Roswell UFO Museum that was centered on the debris that I turned over them. They took most of the debris, they buried it with many of the shrines that were set up in dedication to the Roswell prisoners who never came back, the Japanese prisoners of war, and they gave the prize peaks back to me. And in terms of what had gone on at Roswell, you will even talk to Jesse Marceau Jr., and he'll admit to the fact that he grew up seeing Deutsche Afrika Korps prisoners of war around Roswell who were doing all the scut work in town. And yet he won't cop to Japanese prisoners of war because he's never seen them, because they were kept in isolate, tortured, and ultimately would kill themselves whenever they had the opportunity to put themselves out of their misery. But that's what happened at Roswell. And in terms of by exposing it.
Let me ask.
Yeah.
Let me ask you this now. Roswell was pretty much a war incident then. Let me ask you this. You could answer with just a simple yes or no. But did you ever see any documentation on UFOs that would state that, you know, they're real and the government knows what's going on? Anything in that order?
Absolutely. And this is why when I speak to the astrobiology of God, I want to make it known to people that the universe is very much life hostile. It's a sterile universe. We're not getting any signals from the rest of the universe, and that shouldn't be. If there were life of any intelligent sort, they would be using primitive radio signals at the least. And radio waves travel as fast as the speed of light. And due to the diameter of the galaxy and a bunch of mathematics I go over in my presentation, which will be at the 2012 summit, I prove irrefutably we aren't getting any of these signals. And yet, we have had UFO incidents and apparent visitations for thousands of years. And how do we explain this paradox? And the paradox is explained mostly because it's our descendants from the future. And that's what I'm going to go into at that. And that, if you look into the past, if you look into the universe today, all you can see is the past because the speed of light travels at a certain rate, and even our closest neighbor, Alpha Centauri, we can only see it at the speed of light 4 years ago, how it looked 4 years ago. And as we look into the past, everything we see is empty. There's nothing out there. But if we were to look into the future, we would see a universe teeming with life. It's a universe that's been colonized by us, by ourselves. And
now
that's
I would definitely buy that. I really would. That makes a ton of sense, and that's a theory that I've sat with as well. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Douglas, if you don't mind, maybe we can get to the phone calls quickly, and then leave ourselves a few minutes at the end here for you to give out any information that you'd like again. And I want to say before we even go to these phone calls, you are definitely at the top of my list of most unbelievable guests with just amazing information, and I definitely would like to get you back again to talk about a lot more. I mean, there's just so much. 3 hours isn't enough. But if we could, let's take Wayne in Rhode Island. Just a few minutes here, Wayne. Go ahead.
How you doing, fellas?
Yeah.
All right. How are you?
I wanted to ask Doug about he mentioned the Pilgrims landed in Plymouth, and we know they didn't land there. They landed in Portsmouth, Rhode Island. Also, there's no mention of the agreement with George Washington's troops when the Prince Hall Masons were formed, because that's 10% of George Washington's army was black, and there was an agreement made there that the whole thing's called parting ways. And the Indians, the Wampanoags that are up there in Plymouth, you didn't mention a few things there. I was wondering if you ran across any of those in your document burning.
No, I appreciate your asking that. Obviously, I dealt with hundreds of thousands of documents, and I took copious notes wherever I could. Most of my notes were taken out of personal interest based on my own background ethnically and historically, based on my father's experiences and what that led to my particular interest in, and mostly towards Asia or the Native American area. I ran into a lot concerning African Americans, mostly around the World War II era, when better records were kept. And I'm sure you're absolutely correct that there was far more African American involvement from the very beginning in America's destiny than is publicly acknowledged. But I didn't run into any of that I consciously remember. I hope you understand the fact that of all the notes I took, which literally fill hundreds and hundreds of pages, imagine all that I could not take. And there is so much. What I was committing was a form of cultural genocide. Let's not deny it. And so there's all kinds that's irretrievably lost concerning the history of African Americans, many, many other cultures. So everything that you address, yes, thank you for what you bring up. there's nothing I can say to it of any consequence directly to specifically what you're talking about. As we go into the World War II era, I could speak more to African American issues because, believe it or not, they began to impact directly onto Asian American and Asian Pacific issues at that time because of the war and everything else that was going on. But thank you.
All right. Yeah, thank you so much for the call, Wayne. I appreciate it. And next up, we've got Bruce in New York. Bruce, welcome aboard.
Yeah, how you doing, fellas?
Good. How are you?
I have a question for the guest. I don't know if through his Department of Defense research he ever got involved in anything like records of the assassination of John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy. I was wondering if he had any information revolving around that at all.
Only in the most peripheral sense, and I thank you very much for asking, because that would be one of these holy grails that people are truly after. But what I can tell you is that my father's personnel records, which I had to investigate because I had to get him on disability, then I had to go into his documents. And it turns out that along with many millions of other veterans whose files covered every one of the U.S. Armed Services and all of their armed interventions from the Spanish-American War of 1898 and the Filipino insurrection all the way through the fall of Saigon on April 30th of 1975, they were pumped into the documentary Wicker Man, known as the National Personnel Record Center in St. Louis, Missouri. And this architectural fire trap was a combination in construction of a grain silo and a tinder box. And the local municipal fire department protested the fact that neither fire alarms or sprinkler systems were installed. But as the edifice was on federal property, nothing could be done for it. Now, the GSA, the General Services Administration, runs the Federal Archives. The regional office was in San Bruno, California. And in the course of my primary career as a civilian military librarian, I was able to review in-house Federal Archives Agency training reels before I was ordered to destroy them, exposing the fact that 15 starting points of inception instigated a conflagration that consumed this pile of documents in July of 1975, right as America pulled out of Vietnam. The embers of this facility smoldered for a month, and the Federal Archives saved the U.S. government billions and billions of dollars in veterans' compensation, not to mention obscuring any historical culpability in almost too many atrocities to count, as cited by those files. And as an aside, Lee Harvey Oswald's files and James Earl Ray's files, the military service and medical dossiers were conveniently incinerated in that firestorm, just to name a few of the celebrity files. And any VA bureaucrat will confirm that the VA is still, to this day, dealing with the repercussions of that arson and will perforce continue to do so until the last Vietnam vet dies. And it almost goes without saying that the operations manager of that particular federal facility was found dead with a bullet in his brain, classified as suicide. And the inferno itself was attributed by the U.S. media to war protesters, a physical impossibility obvious to anyone who's ever seen the fortified perimeters of the St. Louis located facility as reconstructed today. The nature of the fire was presented as the functional equivalent of a grain dust explosions in a grain silo, supposedly sourcing from accumulated dust sourcing from the records activity. And, my father, I could go on for hours. I just get so upset by speaking of this. I hope that answers one aspect of your question.
Yeah, I hope that answers your question, Bruce, and I thank you so much for the call. We're going to get Glenn in Florida, and then we'll get George in Tennessee. So, Glenn, welcome aboard.
In immense parts of the landscape, they literally microwaved chickens in their coos, and they did so much damage that he moved up to Canada because he didn't want to live in the United States anymore after that. He comes around, he says, oh, yeah, it's aliens. U.S. government doesn't want you to know. Don't tell anybody. He still gets his government check. He doesn't come home to dead relatives like I did. When I gave my presentation about Roswell and the Rising Sun and came out with my name and face behind it showing that debris that I took concerning the Roswell, which, as I said, was proven by Linda Moulton Howe's electron dispersion spectroscopy test as being Japanese aluminum. And I came out and I took the prize piece with the sigils and the symbols still on it and the paint still on it. I showed it to everyone, allowed them to handle it with gloves on so that their oils from their hands wouldn't taint or degrade the material. I came home to my mother basically dying. And she was a brain-injured 87-year-old woman who many friends of mine were checking on throughout the day. During a 15 to 30-minute break in shift, when she was left alone in her bed with her safety strap on, somebody had gotten to her. And all of those people were prevented from coming by various interventions. They weren't able to come in and check on her for the next 2 hours. I checked all of their cover stories, and it was absolutely true. They weren't cover stories. They were held up by various people who seemed to be government agents. And when I came home and unlocked the door and found my mother on the floor on top of 2 shattered portraits, I brought her to the hospital. They analyzed her, and basically, with their imaging, they said her aorta, the main vein leading to her heart, has been dissected with laser-like precision in 2 places. We can't believe she's still alive. The pressure of blood going through her aorta should be bursting her heart open any second. She should die any second. And she had no contusions, no bruises, no insertions where this could be done. This was technology like they'd never seen. They knew it wasn't me because I didn't possess such technology. Well, a lot of prayers and a lot of help kept her alive for another few months. She died on March 19th of last year. She died 1 year ago today. And that's the price I paid for what I exposed. And I'll tell you something. Immediately they went to Annie Jacobson, who wrote a book called Area 51. And her book was due to come out on March 19th, 1 year ago today, the day my mother died. And they paid her to insert 7 pages of pure bile and crap into her book that is otherwise historically vetted, documented, and irrefutable. She wrote this historically accurate book on Area 51, got paid to insert 7 pages of nonsense, gobbledygook about Mengele, creating deformed children to fly a Horton flying wing for the Soviets, and it made everybody angry, made everybody confused. That was the whole intent of that. That was all part of the disinformation campaign, just like Art's parts that were sent to Art Bell. So this is the kind of efforts that they're going through. Now, when guys like Stan Friedman say what they do, or guys like Lieutenant Colonel Kevin Randall, Lieutenant Colonel, hello, he goes to Iraq, he tells everybody we're building schools in Iraq, it's so great. You notice he doesn't take his family and relocate there. And because of all the depleted uranium, and he'd have radiation cancer like all the troops coming home from Iraq do. That's what Gulf War syndrome is. And then you talk to Lieutenant Colonel Philip J. Corso. He had an office in the Pentagon, for God's sakes. This man comes out and says, "Hey, it's all aliens." Can't you see the horns on these people's heads? The evidence is there that it's not extraterrestrial. It's enemy alien. That was the title used on all the documents. Japanese enemy alien. My mother was an enemy alien until she married my dad in 1951. GIs were not allowed to marry Asian Pacific Islander women because they couldn't tell Vietnamese, Koreans, Taiwanese, or Japanese or Chinese apart. And as a result, until the Japanese-American Peace Treaty in 1951, Uniform Code of Military Justice would put men in jail who were soldiers or sailors who married Asian Pacific women. Marlon Brando made a movie on it called Sayonara because they had so many lover suicides. And we're talking about something that impacted tens of thousands of people in history. Nobody remembers that. All they remember is this crap that's fed to them about aliens at Roswell. Who started it? The satanic colonel I worked for, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino. He worked with PSYOPs in 1969. He was brought back to set up the Roswell myth because in 1969, Sergeant Melvin Brown started to talk. Sergeant Melvin Brown was at Roswell, and he was told not to look at the bodies. He lifted the tarp, and he saw what he described as yellow-skinned, very small men whose skin was burnt orange by the crash. And he said they turned gray with decomposition and rigor mortis. He began to talk when men started walking on the moon in July of 1969. And he turned to his family and he said, I worked with all these dead enemy aliens. They thought he meant extraterrestrials. And everything was out of the bag. They called Colonel Aquino back out of Vietnam, where he was serving his tour duty with PSYOPs. They said, we want you to do PSYOPs on the American public and start this whole Roswell deal. And they said, Lyndon Baines Johnson is moving Roswell Army Airfield out of the Roswell area. They got no economy left. So Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino went over there and he said, I'll give you a deal with the devil. He says, if you start pumping this alien thing, we'll float your economy. You don't need no military base. You're going to have more money than you know what to do with. We're going to turn this into the Lourdes, the Medjugorje of a new religion. And that was his biggest joke in the world that he played on a predominantly Christian-American public. He says, I got them believing that their God is in the image of a ballless midget who's gray. And he laughed his ass off the bank every day.
Well,
anything else, Mike?
Douglas, I definitely want to read all the things I can that you've said. I'm very sorry for your loss. My dad was killed by our government as well with Agent Orange. In Vietnam, he was a delayed casualty.
Right.
But so I'm sorry for your loss. But do you believe that there's any aliens out there or any crashes? Obviously, Roswell, you're saying is fake. So I was just wondering what's your opinion on on anything else? And what about the sightings? What are they, demons? What do you think?
No, I think that there are legitimate, as I shared with Mr. Vara, I think that there are descendants from the future, and we have colonized the universe in the future. And there are other intelligent species. There are other sentient species. They've evolved here on Earth. The planet Earth is singular in that it has produced life. It all sources from here, including other sentient species that we would consider to be aliens. But I'll discuss that in future episodes with Mr. Vara,
sure.
And I'll discuss that at the 2012 summit. You can look all of this up on my website, and of course, please, for the sake of my mother's memory, do investigate Roswell and the Rising Sun. You can get it in DVD form while we still have it in DVD. We're going to sell them till we're running out of the DVD sets because we're releasing it all in print at the UFOCon, which you can look up on my website too, where I'll be speaking specifically on this subject at Santa Clara Marriott in California, and that'll be in September of this year. So the DVDs are two for the price of one, just $20 plus $5 shipping and handling anywhere in the world. And one of them is Satan's Crusaders, talking about my decade of liaison to the Satanic Chaplaincy. The other one is dealing with Roswell and the Rising Sun, and they both intertwine with each other for the reasons I just explained. So please check that out.
What's your website?
DouglasDietrich.com, www.douglasdietrich.com. Douglas is with one S. Dietrich is spelled just like the famous actress I'm distantly related to, Marlene Dietrich. D-I-E, well, just put the words diet and rich together. Diet Rich. DouglasDietRich.com.
I like that. Yeah. Hey, Douglas, I got some other questions if we got time.
Go ahead.
Real quick, this is totally off topic, but we've all heard the rumors about an inner Earth or an underground area where there's all these giants and all that. Anything on inner Earth that you've ever researched?
Absolutely. In the last year that I was working at the Presidio military base of San Francisco in 1992, there was an article that was released by A.B. Thompson in Nature magazine that was so scientific, and it was volume 358, as a matter of fact, and it was so scientific in its jargon, no normal human being other than a trained geophysicist would understand it, but it was stating what I was dealing with in military documents that went back to World War II. And it was the fact that the mantle of the Earth, the deep layers of Earth's structure, contain loads. Not loads like L-O-A-D-S, but loads as in mineral loads, L-O-D-E-S, but these are loads of water. And these loads of water are so immense that they dwarf the existing oceans. And even as recently as 2007, scientists have found through evidence of seismic waves a tremendous underwater ocean in the porous rock structure deep beneath Beijing. And that was published in New Scientist in March 2007. Scientists from Tokyo that same year observed the dragging down of water at subduction zones. What all this points to is what I worked with in documents that went back to World War II, which was that there is a tremendous network of subterranean, sunless oceans that cross the Earth, and that these were where the Nazi government in exile relocated. And that would take a whole nother show. And if people start laughing, they don't understand. Waters are corrosive. These inner caverns, it's not a hollow Earth, it's an inner Earth. These inner caverns go through the lattice work of our upper mantle, and they are caverns created by water erosion that are a mile high, and thanks to condensation, they have weather, they have rain. And the only thing lacking is a source of light. So all of the creatures are albino, all of the creatures are blind, but the Nazi government in exile has set up an artificial lighting system and has relocated and cultivated a civilization down there that was in contact with the surface world until 1997. 1997, all contact broke off. That would take an entirely new show to go into.
Douglas,
well, we're going to have you back a lot.
Douglas, are you familiar with the show Sanctuary on Sci-Fi? I mean, it's almost like exactly what you're talking about. A lot of times I'll put things right in plain view. You know, they talk about these creatures or these big caverns and everything, but we got to move on. So I didn't want to stop there. But what about free energy, Tesla, and you got to cover vampires because I got to hear what the heck you got on vampires too.
Sure. To tell you about Tesla, just to cover him briefly, he was a victim of the same kind of criminality that interred the American Japanese. And what had happened was right after Pearl Harbor, the Americans used this as an excuse just like the Third Reich with Kristallnacht, where they robbed the Jewish community of all of their material goods, the Americans created the Office of Alien Property to basically steal and redistribute all of the fiscal, real, and material properties of Japanese Americans. Keep in mind, when they were interred in 1942, all of the civil statutes of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution were still in effect because martial law was never declared. And yet, all of their rights as citizens, their citizenship was deprived. They were deprived of their liberty without due process of law. They were certainly denied equal protection of the laws, and all of their property was stolen. And unlike in Germany, nobody can deny this. The Konzentrationslager, or the concentration camps, and the Totenslager, the death camps, they were all covert. It was a covert operation. The German tax-paying public was denied knowledge of their existence. Most of them were located outside of Germany itself. And Hitler had to create a second army, the SS, to act as the vanguard of the Holocaust. In the United States, the American government said, hey, we're going to just take these people on basis of their ethnicity, lock them up. What do you say? And the American public said, that's great. That's cool. We dig it. And as a result, decades later, when the Supreme Court, in one of its strangest and most ambiguous decisions, retroactively handed down by that tribunal, decided that this was constitutional. Well, at that point, because of that extremely dangerous decision, no minority group is safe today. And today we have an ethnic president, and Caucasians are the minority. And certainly no individual is safe from unexpected detention or incarceration. That's what happened to Tesla. In 1943, so disgusted with what they were asking him to do with the Philadelphia experiment, and so used and abused by Thomas Edison and robber barons like J.P. Morgan, he gave as much documentation as could be physically carried to his Yugoslav nephew, who was a diplomat to Yugoslavia. He brought them back to Yugoslavia. At that time, Croatia was an active ally of the Third Reich, an Axis satellite. Serbia was invaded by the communists, and that's how the Soviet Union and the Third Reich wound up with Tesla technology. And Tesla, that was the way he planned it, because he figured it has to go to other empires, no matter how villainous, because otherwise this technology would never become the property of all mankind. If the Americans retained a total control of it, they would enslave the world under a few individuals. So when he turned it over, he knew he would pay the price. The Americans called him up and they said, we're depriving you of your citizenship just like any Jap. You're going to be incarcerated. We're coming for you now. He killed himself. And that's the documents that I dealt with. And you know who took all his property and put it under national security status to this very day? OAP, Office of Alien Property. The same people who took all the Japanese property. You can look that up.
Oh, God.
All right, Glenn.
Vampires is the last thing. I just got to know what vampires is. I'm out of here. You guys have a good one.
Take care.
All
we'll
right,
speak of that on another episode.
Well, we may end up a few minutes over. I'm just letting people know in case we run 5 minutes over or whatever. 858-683-1309. You'll want to call in to listen to any extension that we do here. So, okay, with that being said, vampires.
Oh, well, I'm going to be releasing my book, The Reality of the Red Undead, which speaks of the Soviet work with a subspecies of genus Homo sapiens that's been around for untold millennia, that's always existed amongst us, that is known to the Western world as vampires. The Soviet Union started incorporating and drafting these people or other species of hominid forcibly around the time of the Second World War, and were cultivating them within a colony of prisoners of this hominid species throughout the Cold War, as the Americans call it, which I really try to educate the Americans to realizing was the Third World War. And it led to the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. But my book on that, The Red Undead, will be released at the June 2nd and 3rd convention at Conspiracy Con. And I hope to see you there, and I can autograph copies of the book. But believe me, vampires exist. Speak of them there, and I'll be happy to speak of them here at length on another episode. But if I go into it now, we're going to be covering this for hours.
Yeah, okay, I understand that. Let's take one more call, and then we'll finish up here tonight. And let me say quickly that I appreciate all the information you provided us tonight, and you taking the time out to be with us. And definitely we'll stay in touch. I do want to get you back. We got several more topics we can cover. So let's take George in Tennessee. Welcome aboard, George. Thanks for waiting.
Thank you. Douglas, good to speak to you.
Yeah, honor, sir. Thank you.
You're actually a brother, and you don't know it, but you really are. Listen, there's a lot of things I'd like to ask you about. I don't want to keep you. I'd like to give somebody else a chance if y'all sneak them in there. I got 3 or 4 topics I'd like to lay on you. You just pick one if you want to comment. If you say you'd rather not comment on any of them, that's fine.
Yes.
I share your excitement with the vast world of knowledge that's out here. I think it's a shame that our government hasn't been more open with the citizens of this country, because there's a whole lot of people that could have contributed that didn't even know anything was going on, but they could have picked it up and accelerated with something. All right, the topics I'd like to present to you for possible comment is one thing I'd like to know, since you seem to be a humanitarian type person like myself, do you know anything about a written order issued by the Secretary of War or the Interior after Custer's last stand, when the media got through bouncing the public all around and inciting them? Do you know anything about a written order that the cavalry was sent to the cavalry to go forth and kill every red man, woman, and child on the North American continent? That's one thing. Another thing is the Scorpion and the Thresher. Both of those were lost exploring underground waterways that start from Monterey Bay and goes into Hawthorne in the middle of the United States. That's only one of 3 or 4 that they have. The water system goes way under. I know about the tunnels under oceans and all kinds of stuff. But anyway, another thing, the federal building, they did use bombs on the federal building, but they also used a high-tech energy they used a high-energy laser beam. So I reckon you call it a laser beam, but they used that, and it just ripped that building in half. And the whole Oklahoma City Police Department knows the ones responsible, because they know the ones that gave McVeigh and them the daggone explosives. And they won't go in and get them because it's a higher level of government. I don't know what the hell has happened in this country. The friggin' sheriffs are supposed to go out and deputize a bunch of farmers with pitchforks and shotguns and hunting rifles and surround that place and handcuff them bastards. And anyway, I don't want to get into it, because I'm like you. I'll get excited and get going. One thing I know, it's my understanding that I think the Japanese are some of the most honorable people that I know anything about. Them and true red-blooded American Indians but anyway, after
thank you, sir.
It's my understanding, and I don't want to tell you where I got my sources, but I understand that Japan petitioned the United States for almost 3 months to allow them to conditionally surrender after their little gizmo and their little get-together and their charade about bombing Pearl Harbor, because there ain't no way that with the sonar and radar that it could have crossed out all that ocean. That was a setup. That was done just like the 9/11 in Oklahoma and all them attacks on them embassies and all that stuff. But the Pope supported Hitler. He wanted dead Christians. They shared in the loot that they stole from them people, and the Catholic Church was supporting the rest of the war too, and they wanted more dead Christians, so they picked the most Christian cities in all of Japan, and the United States stalled the surrender because the Pope wanted dead Christians that they hadn't gotten yet, and the United States wanted to test one of their new toys. So they stalled Japan. Then they bombed Christian cities, because the United States has to test all of their weapons on humans before they're good to go. They got a bunch of them sitting right now that they're going to test on American citizens if Navarro doesn't come through here and cause the earth to sweep itself clean. But they like to kill and rob everybody. But the Pope has meant the Catholic Church, Rothschild, 500 trillion, the Catholic Church that much, the Queen. I know she's a descendant from the pharaohs, and I believe she's a Dracul too, one of those one of them reptilian races of people. And the moon, I understand that the moon, I got it on good source, a couple of them. The moon is a constructed apparatus. It's a deep space station. There's aliens living all over it. It's been on it. It's got pyramids on it.
All right.
There's aliens.
George, I have to. I'm sorry. I mean, very interesting, but I have to stop you there because we are getting at the end here, and I want to give our guests a chance to comment. So, Douglas, go ahead.
Yes, thanks so much. I appreciate your input. Thank you very much for what you said. To respond to what you said about the Pope and the Vatican first, yes, I personally knew a survivor of this kind of duplicity of which you speak. My father was a devout Roman Catholic, but I was never baptized, so I was never a member of the Roman Catholic Church. And it is a nation state. It was the first nation state, the Vatican, to recognize the Third Reich in the world. And what had happened was that during World War II, Croatia became Vatican territory. It was not Italian occupied. It was Vatican territory. And the orders came out directly from the papacy to kill 1/3, expel 1/3 of the Serbs, and to convert 1/3 of the Serbs forcibly. So a figure of about 2 million Serbian civilians were killed in Croatian extermination camps. These were totally separate. They were not under Nazi control. The only extermination camps in the world set up specifically for children were set up at Tuzno and Lovnic in Croatia. They were run by Roman Catholic nuns. And during the war, the United States Army Air Corps accepted protection money from the Vatican, so they never bombed Croatia. Instead, they bombed America's ally, the Serbs. So American bombs killed about 600,000 Germans, 900,000 Japanese, 62,000 Italians, and 24,000 Serbs. And to add to the criminality here, the largest prisoner of war, MIA, missing in action rescue, ever conducted was conducted by the Serbs when the Americans bombed Romania and the Ploesti oil fields. They had several hundred men shot down by the Luftwaffe. They were stuck in Romania. The Serbs who border Romania pulled them out of Romania and brought over 600,000 of these American airmen down to be rescued. I knew one of them personally, a Jewish-American airman named Richard Feldman from Phoenix, Arizona. He spent the rest of his life trying to expose the fact that 221 Serbs died to bring him alone out of Romania. And how did the Americans respond? Because they were paid by the Vatican, they turned around after they got their airmen back, put them in planes, and ordered them to bomb Serbia on Serbian Orthodox Christmas, right after everyone was leaving church, and killed thousands of Serbs. That's the American U.S. Army Air Corps for you. And in terms of what you were speaking about with the American Indians, yes, the Apache extermination policy would be one of the things that was set up by a committee that was a Senate report that was made in around the 1870s, and it stated quite blatantly that the Americans should adopt the Mexican theory of extermination by acts of inhuman treachery and cruelty because the Indians themselves are implacable foes. And, the policy resulted in a war in which, lasted about a decade, in which cost Americans about 1,000 lives, $40 million, and led to the extermination almost of the Apache tribe. And one of the ways that the Americans were maneuvering this was that President Rutherford Hayes, that individual who I spoke of, who stole the election, he basically was talking about making all Indians full citizens of the United States with constitutional rights, which meant, of course, that all the treaties they made with the Indians were null and void because the government couldn't have treaties with its own citizens. So that meant all the treaty land was open to the public under the Homestead Act. And in return for this act of executive recognition, Hayes demanded an act of faith to the government, service in the Army on the frontier for all Indian males between the ages of 20 and 40. And that's how you got the term Indian Scout. That's how we wound up with all these Indian Scouts. Basically, this supposedly generous measure was a tactical coup accomplishing basically what was failed to do by extermination since the colonies began, separating the Indians from their land. And so this is the kind of perfidy that we're speaking of in the Trail of Broken Treaties that, by the way, they never got their citizenship. American Indians were never allowed to vote until after the Second World War. This addresses hopefully some of what you're speaking of. There's plenty of other things you brought up that I can't speak to, but I appreciate, elements of what you did bring up, and thank you. I hope my answers were coherent.
I think so. And George, I thank you for your call. I really do. We're running out of time here. I do have one more quick question because I've had a few people pound me about this. Did you ever see any documentation? We hear about it all the time. It's kind of what the caller was talking about a little bit, about Nibiru Planet X. Anything on any big planet or dwarf star coming through and wiping us out? Yeah, well, keep in mind, there are regular mass extinctions on the planet
every several million years. And if we're in the middle of one now, it really is. I know this is controversial, and a lot of people hate to hear this. It really is man-made. We may very well be in the middle of a mass extinction now that seems to be made by human beings. And that's why it's so important to do what we can now to alter our behavior patterns. I'm not talking about fossil fuel emissions. I'm just talking about even beyond taking down the rainforest. It's just overpopulation and pollution. But in terms of Nibiru, the mass extinctions are caused by a dark brown dwarf star that is way out in the reefs of space of the solar system that is on extremely elongated orbit. It's never going to head into the inner solar system. That's not how it works. But it's like a brown dwarf star that's literally about the size of Jupiter or Saturn, and it basically has its own microsolar system of its own, a planet surrounding it, and it just crosses the path of what is known as the Kuiper belt, or the Kuiperoids, of these Pluto-sized planetoids that are surrounding the outer edge and a disk of our solar system, and sends multiple comets and cometoids our way that cause these mass extinctions. And so this happens every few millions of years, something like 14, 17, 21 million years. I forget exactly. I'd have to look back at my notes about the geophysics of that or the astrophysics of that. But I'll speak to it in the lecture Astrobiology of God, the 2012 summit. So please, if at all possible, Mountain View, California, do attend, because I bring this up as one of the reasons why our solar system is so unique, because it's those mass extinctions that make new life possible. And so it's very much a clockwork mechanism, and there's no other solar system we're seeing that's like it. So we are very unique. We are indeed, in terms of life, the center of the universe. Make no mistake about it. It all sources from here. And so that's part of the natural process. It's not a doomsday mechanism that's going to kill us. We will be off this planet as a transmigrational species across the galaxy long before it strikes again.
All right. Well, I'm glad to hear that. Now, I guess last but not least, you probably encourage people the same as I do to get involved and to get this information out, and not to be afraid to take your head out of the sand and tell people about this, right?
Yeah. Well, it's like I've said before, I'm going to be a lot harder to kill than my 87-year-old, unfortunately brain-injured mother was. And so I want you all to take the attitude that even if that happens, the worst they can do is kill you. And for many of us, that would be more of a relief than a threat. But aside from that, I do want all of us to know that whatever you're suffering right now, we are headed towards a new dark age, but it will get better after that. Just try to survive to participate in Reconstruction. There's no need for any violent revolution to incite any insurrection against this government. It's destroying itself through its own incompetence. You don't need to worry about the United Nations and the evil empire, because they make the United States look like the picture of Prussian efficiency with how corrupt and incompetent they are. So you will triumph in the end with whatever moral code and ethic that you will be able to pass on to your children and your children's children. Just try to live long enough to see that happen and to make that happen.
Well, I love happy endings. And, hey, send me your links to your events, and I'll get them up on my website. I like supporting people who spread the truth, absolutely. So I'd be glad to throw those up.
I'll do that as soon as we're off the air. And bless you. Thank you so much for having me on. Again, I thank your audience for their wonderful participation. So did we make it on time? Did we do the deadline, or did we go a little over?
We went about 4 minutes over, but that's okay, because I think people are still hearing us live, actually. So it all works out. Thank you so much, Douglas.
Yeah, you're the best, sir, and thank you for what you do. I really appreciate that, Mr. Mara. And I'm sorry, Vara, Michael Vara. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm not good with names either, so I'm not going to hold that against you. Thank you.
Thank you.
I feel the same. It's been a pleasure having you on the program. human beings. I don't know, maybe demons would be a better word for it.
I think that would give him too much credit.
Yeah, you're right. That's absolutely right. It just might.
But
now,
like
how did you?
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say I'd like to put that into perspective for you, however, because one of the
Please
things
do.
that I was assigned, on top of all the other responsibilities I was delegated, and that was the problem because I was one of the few people who came. I was born in Taiwan myself. And so I have a Confucianist work ethic, and this is one reason why the Asian Pacific economies have succeeded so admirably is because they do have a Confucianist work ethic and are committed to the same kind of dedication to work that Protestant Americans used to have in the days of Puritan pioneering when they first came to the United States, long before there was a United States government, 200 years before there was a United States government. So because of that, I was delegated all kinds of workload that nobody else wanted to do. One of the things that I was assigned was liaison status to the United States Army's officially recognized satanic chaplain, Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino, who was later to retire a full bird colonel. He lives only a few blocks from me. He's basically a neighbor of mine. I worked with him for nearly a decade, and here was a man who basically reshaped a good deal of the Army in his image. We probably won't go into that too much tonight because that would take an entire show that would be dedicated to that, and I could go.
We'll have to have you back.
I appreciate that, but I do want to emphasize the fact that some of the things I did for him, and the reason they assigned me as a DoD librarian, as liaison to the satanic chaplain, was because he had top-level security clearances of the kind that I've been mentioning. He was on second mint to NATO. He was in the World Affairs Council, and this individual therefore had access to not only secrets in the United States, but in the United Kingdom and its Commonwealth. And he took advantage of that status to basically order grimoires, or occult texts, from museums and libraries all over the world. Private institutions were out of touch for him, but public institutions such as universities and also the museums were within his reach because he would use the excuse of national and international security. And he would say, I need these ancient grimoires or texts, and I need them for national security reasons. They would deliver them to the library as if they were fine china or porcelain by a courier. These are things that are normally in refrigerated safes or display cases, and even anthropologists or archaeologists are not allowed to touch them because just moving them and opening them could destroy or compromise the integrity of the volume because they're so old. And they're literally priceless because they were handwritten. Some of them were written in blood. Some of them were bound in human flesh. And these things he would have taken to the library. Now, per regulations, they could not leave the library. He couldn't bring them home. He could order them, and then he had to use them at the library. And for this reason, I was personally witness to many satanic rituals within the library itself because I worked the night shift doing document destruction. So while I was putting documents into the incinerators, which were truly, literally modified crematoria because I was putting in entire locker boxes that were the size of children's coffins, the kind of wooden locker boxes that used to be found at the foot of military bunks back in the frontier days. These were used to host documents, and my job would be to open them, collate the documents, make sure they were the right ones to destroy, shove them in the incinerator. I'd be working throughout the night while this man and the various members of his coven would be operating satanic rituals to which I was witness of the results. So I can assure you there are demons within the military, and the reason that men like Lieutenant Colonel Michael Aquino succeeded so
Well, as well, we appreciate you spending your precious and valuable time with us as well. I appreciate the work that you do and getting the word out about what's really going on because there's no doubt that we are being lied to, and we have been being lied to for a long time. So I guess, first off, I've got you linked up over on latenightinthemidlands.com so people can get over to your website and check you out.
Wonderful.
Maybe you could... Great. All right. So maybe you could take us through a little bit of your background and some of the time that you spent with the military's Department of Defense. Now, you were a librarian, correct?
That's correct, sir. What had happened was that when I was about 16 years old, and I was attending John H. O'Connell Vocational Institute in San Francisco, there was an Albanian receptionist who worked there who used to be the secretary to the mayor of San Francisco, George Moscone. She happened to be in the office on the day that Dan White walked in, pushed her to the ground, and went through the door and shot dead the mayor of San Francisco and Supervisor Harvey Milk, who had replaced him in his job. And as a result, Dianne Feinstein, who is now a senator, seceded to the mayoralty of San Francisco, and she felt she didn't need a woman around who had a reputation for being George Moscone's lap secretary. So this lady wound up looking for a job and wound up being the receptionist at a vocational institute where I attended school. And I myself had grown up a military dependent. My father had been in the Navy for over 30 years. He was born in 1919, had run away from home to join the Navy when he was underage, about 16 years of age. He wound up serving in the China gunboat patrols up the Yangtze River in Spanish-American war relics that were still coal burners. And so these were the kind of situations that were made known to the public through the movie The Sand Pebbles that was written by a veteran of the Navy as well. That movie was actually started in a book format that was written by a naval veteran who had served as unhappily as my father had. And so my father's tombstone says it all. Says World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. And the truth was that World War II started at the time that my dad was on those gunboat patrols when the Japanese bombed the USS Pan A and the HMS Lady Bird, and this was on December 13th of 1937. And from that point on, if you had talked to any American during that period of time, this was the Tonkin Gulf incident of its day, any American would have told you, yeah, we're at war with the Japanese in China, and it was just generally acknowledged. So the whole idea that there was a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor, even in the public sense, is absurd. But the generation of that time had a real ability to rewrite their memories, and which is just fascinating to me, and is one of the primary reasons why they were easily manipulated by the PSYOPs, which I've been addressing in a lot of my discussions. But I myself, getting back to where I was in John O'Connell, she, being Albanian, used to broadcast for Radio Free Europe through the Department of Defense to get transmissions behind the Iron Curtain into Albania. And so she knew that there were some openings in the DOD at a library that was on the Presidio military base, which I had access to as a military dependent. So she said, well, since you're a military dependent and you've already got access to the base, why don't you apply for this job? So I did, and I succeeded in getting it, and my entire life was to be changed from that point on in a monumental direction. So what had happened was once I started working there, I was a civilian working for a civilian bureaucracy on-site a military base. And to put this into perspective for you, I had a very low security clearance, the same kind of security clearance that any military dependent has to get on or off a military base. I had full access to any open military base, barring restricted areas. But once I started working at the library, I was given the top secret clearance. But again, to explain this to the audience, a top secret clearance is the absolute rock bottom of security clearance levels. So if you've got relatives or friends in the military and they come bragging to you, oh, I've got a top secret security clearance, you really got to put this in perspective. And there are entire gradations of letter and numeric designations that add to higher levels of security clearance up to the point where it reaches just very, very bizarre titles. But the point that I'm making is that even the President of the United States, because he's only executive and commander-in-chief for 4 to 8 years, has a comparatively low security clearance level. Generals who are in for 30 years and then spend the next 10 years on some kind of consultation arrangement with the military in retirement, generals like that have security clearance levels that are far, far above that of the executive or the commander-in-chief, namely the president. So basically, I hope that puts it into some perspective for you in terms of the situation that I had, and then we add on to that the complex layers of corruption, stupidity, and incompetence that is so endemic in federal bureaucracy, which enabled me, not voluntarily, but under protest, to work with secret documents that were well above my security clearance level for almost a decade. And my primary responsibility was initially documents destruction. And I started off as the librarian's aide. Within a year was a military reference technician, and within 2 years was a full-fledged Department of Defense research librarian. But throughout that period of time, my superiors, our operations manager in particular, had far higher security clearance levels, but because when you work for the government, no matter what you do, no matter how incompetent you are, you can never be fired. You can even go postal, start killing your fellow office workers. They will send in a SWAT team to take you down, but you'll die employed. So no matter what you do, you can go to work, you can clock in, you can go to sleep. And that's what many people do. I've seen this all my life when working for the government. And this is why your government is basically run to the ground. This is why nothing gets done except by accident. So a lot of people ask, why is Douglas Dietrich still alive? Well, one of the things is, for one thing, this is the anniversary of my mother's death. She died very specifically. She died 1 year ago today. We might bring that up later in our interview. But the point of fact is, I did not survive unscathed. And but I'm a lot harder to kill than my mother, who was 87 years old and suffered from traumatic brain injuries. And so besides that, I've got incompetence and corruption on my side. The weakest element is the human element, and it's humans that comprise the United States government. And it's not just any humans. It's the most lazy, incompetent, corrupt humans imaginable that are involved with the United States government at this point in history. And as we'll go over in our general outline of a lot of what went on with Asian Pacific and American relations tonight, and as well as American relations with the Native Americans at home, because it all shares into that general history, we'll find out that this has been going on forever. And it's amazing that it's lasted this long, to tell you the truth. I hope that puts it into some perspective for you.
It does, and you'll get no argument out of me. I mean, it's obvious the people who are in charge are just totally incompetent. And
United States to do the same kind of incompetent, violent peacekeeping that they do in other countries? You bet they would. But I'll tell you reasons why you don't need to worry about this. Examples of how they operate. When I served as a mercenary in East Africa, I probably saw more of the United Nations operating in the field that gave me a perspective on it that pretty much reaffirmed the kind of corruption that I saw in all the documents I was destroying. One horrible example of this was the kind of environment in East Africa. The lingua franca is Swahili, and it's spoken everywhere from Kenya down to the northern tip of Mozambique. And what you have is a Muslim-dominated culture in which there is, in the Swahili language, there's no word for woman. Literally, there is no word for woman. The closest thing that they have to it is mwanamke, which is a possessive, a noun that refers to ewes, sows, mares, and human woman as property of the masculine, feminine property of the masculine. That's the closest thing they've got. And as a result, their attitude is already bad concerning slavery. And female sexual slavery, by the way, slavery is legal in the Islamic world. Under Sharia law, Quranic law has slavery as legitimately recognized. And African slavery in the Middle Eastern Peninsula is rife and continues to this day just as it has for 1,400 years. The history of slavery in the Western world, chattel slavery, it's about 300 years old. And but you've got it beat by about 4 times that amount of time, and it still continues today in Southwest Asia and the Middle East. And so we ran into a camp of slavers where they had women who were locked in cages that were being sent to the markets in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, these women were being raped every day, by their captors. And the United Nations was well aware of this. And their answer to this problem was to provide United Nations condoms, baby blue, sky blue condoms that were in United Nations boxes with the United Nations polar projection map on the cover of their boxes, just so that these slavers wouldn't spread AIDS.
I wonder if these are the same condoms they want schools to hand out to our children here.
It does make one wonder. And what we came up against at that time in order to liberate this camp was a United Nations force. Now, I'm very leery about speaking about this because there's always the possibility of being accused of war crimes by fighting against United Nations peacekeepers and being brought to trial on The Hague. So I try not to give too many details, but I will tell you this. People we ran up against...
Don't get yourself in trouble.
I understand. But it's one of those things that it's this important to me to make the American public aware of what they would be up against with United Nations peacekeeping forces.
Okay.
You kind of were made aware of this with Black Hawk Down, though they never really emphasized it. But in Black Hawk Down, these U.S. Army Rangers were trapped in Somalia, and Mogadishu specifically, the capital of Somalia, nominally, in name only. There is no capital to Somalia. Somalia is a state of total anarchy. And when they were fighting their way out, there was an entire United Nations armored unit that could have gone in any time to have rescued them. And this United Nations armored unit just stood by, and that's what you see at the end of the film. It's accurately portrayed. When you see all those Rangers all wounded, and they're just marching and walking, straggling would be a correct word for it, towards that armored unit of United Nations peacekeepers in those white armored cars and micro-tanklets. These were all Pakistani Muslims who refused to rescue the Americans. Tremendously in reshaping the Army in their image was because the rest of the Army and the Department of Defense were so incredibly stupid, incompetent, fat, happy, and lazy and corrupt that one intelligent man of evil inclination could get away with anything he wanted.
Amazing. And that's not to say that, everybody in the military is bad, but that, the ones who are running it certainly questionable.
Well, that's important to bring up because I knew many of the officers who were victimized by Colonel Aquino. There was literally, later on at West Point, an officers' massacre. Now, those people I didn't know personally. I was much more familiar with the Presidio situation, but the Presidio was the epicenter of what scandalized. Let me put Presidio military base in perspective for you. Like, people will ask, perhaps, why is it that Dietrich is destroying such top-level documents? What are they doing at the Presidio military base as opposed to, say, Washington, D.C.? Well, the answer to that was that the Presidio military base was the Western Defense Command Center, and it was the headquarters of the United States Sixth Army. All of the wars in the Pacific, which have been all of America's wars, from the wars in the Philippines during the Spanish-American War, which could be considered America's first overseas Vietnam, all the way to many Latin American wars on the Pacific coast of Chile and Peru, in which America literally went to war over bird droppings, over guano, all the way to World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. All of these involved the Presidio military base as the center point of logistics. And aside from that, 3 weeks and 3 days after Pearl Harbor, the United Nations was formed on-site the Presidio military base, January 1st, 1942. And from that point on, unknown to most Americans, World War II was a United Nations conflict, like a Korean conflict. And the United States was subsidiary to the United Nations from that point on, which was established on the Presidio military base as an organization of war. Per Title 42, or Article 42 of the United Nations Charter, in lieu of a constitution, they have a charter. They are an organization of war. And they were meant to combat the Axis, and their primary military responsibility was direction of resistance armies in nations that were under Axis occupation. So that meant the resistance armies everywhere from Denmark through to the Philippines had their exile governments operating on the Presidio military base of San Francisco. So when it was relocated to New York City come the ceasefire in 1945, all of its military documentation was maintained at the Presidio military base. These were the documents I was destroying in Maine, United Nations war documents pertaining to World War II.
Okay, and why don't we get into some of those documents? Tell us about the documents that you had to destroy, and maybe give us some detail if you could.
Before that, sir, was there something you were trying to get out before I so rudely interrupted? Was there something else on your mind that you wanted to bring up? Because the documents could bring us into other directions that could, take up a great deal of our conversation. I want to make sure that you get certain objects of interest out that you might have been thinking of beforehand.
Oh, you're absolutely covering it all. I'm just I'm sitting back and soaking in the information, and I guess the only other question I would have at this point is, obviously this is a plan that they've had for a long time for what I would call a New World Order or one world government.
It's an interesting perspective, and obviously you're not alone in this. There are many people who share your opinion on this. But if you think the United States government is incompetent and corrupt, the United Nations goes it 10 times better. Believe me, the United Nations and the people involved with it, if they could, would they send United Nations forces into the